In 1867, a child named Harvey Alexander Logan entered existence in the dark soil of Richland Township, Iowa, born into a nation still sweeping up the shattered glass of the Civil War. He was not born into wealth or promise, but into the hard-scrabble reality of the Midwest Reconstruction, where men returned home with missing limbs and hollow eyes, and the ground yielded corn only after a fight with the plow. The air in the Logan household was thick with the dust of poverty and the unspoken tension of a family trying to survive on the edge of destitution. His father, William Logan, was a phantom in the boy's life, a man whose presence faded into the background before vanishing entirely, leaving Harvey and his three brothers, Hank, Johnny, and Lonnie, to cling to the skirts of their mother, Elizabeth. She was the only softness in a world made of iron and oak, but her strength was finite. By 1876, the harshness of the frontier life claimed Elizabeth. Logan, and her death severed the last tether, keeping the boys anchored to a sense of gentle morality. Harvey stood at the graveside in the biting wind, watching the black earth of Iowa cover the only person who had ever looked at him with unconditional affection. He was 9 years old. The grief did not break him, it calcified him. The four brothers were shipped off to Dodson, Missouri to live with an aunt who viewed them as four hungry mouths rather than grieving children. The Missouri dirt was redder, the summers hotter, and the labor harder. Harvey stopped looking for comfort and started looking for leverage. He learned early that the world respected a fist more than a tear, and his hands, though small, grew calloused and quick. He worked the fields until his back screamed, absorbing the lesson that survival was a transaction of pain for bread. As the 1880s dawned, the Logan boys outgrew the confines of the aunt's strict household. The American West was screaming for the men who could ride and shoot, and the brothers heard the call like a siren song. They were not looking for adventure. They were looking for money in a place where no one asked about their lineage. They drifted toward the cattle towns, where the economy ran on beef and blood. Harvey, short in stature but dense with muscle, found he had a knack for breaking horses. He possessed a terrifying patience, a willingness to outlast the animal's fury until it broke under his will. This talent translated to his interactions with men. He spoke little, his dark eyes observing the room, calculating threats, and cataloging exits. In 1883, the brothers moved toward the chaotic hub of Dodge City, Kansas. It was a sensory assault of cattle stench, gun smoke, and cheap whiskey. Here, Harvey saw the law as a fluid concept, something purchased by the wealthy cattle barons to keep the rabble in line. He watched marshals pistol-whip drunks and saw card sharps gutted in alleys. It was an education in violence, and Harvey proved to be a scholar. He did not drink to excess in those early days. He watched. He watched how men died and, more importantly, how men survived. He saw that the survivor was rarely the loudest man in the room, but often the one who drew his weapon with the least hesitation. The brothers signed on for a cattle drive north, pushing a massive herd toward the greener pastures of the Wyoming and Montana territories. The drive was a grueling crucible that stripped away any remaining softness from Harvey's youth. Days began before the sun cracked the horizon and ended long after the moon rose, filled with the dust of 2,000 hooves clogging his throat and eyes. He ate grit with his beans and slept on ground hard enough to bruise bone. The weather was a sadistic master, hitting them with baking heat one week and hail the size of marbles the next. During a stampede near the Platte River, Harvey rode his horse into the churning mass of horns and muscle, turning the lead steer with a whip and a scream, displaying a reckless disregard for his own safety that earned the silent respect of the older drovers. He learned to sleep with one hand on his revolver, a habit that would never leave him. By 1884, the Logan brothers crossed into the Montana territory. The landscape here was different, violent, vertical, and imposing. The little Rocky Mountains rose from the plains like fortress walls, offering shelter to wolves, bears, and men who preferred the shadows. The brothers drifted to the mining camp of Landuski, named after Powell Pike Landuski, a rough-hewn Missouri native who had carved out a fiefdom in the wilderness. Landuski was a hard man, known for a temper as volatile as dynamite and a face scarred by years of brawling. He held sway over the region, and from the moment the Logan boys rode into his orbit, the air grew heavy with inevitability. Harvey and his brothers settled on a patch of land at Rock Creek, aiming to try their hand at ranching. They built a cabin from logs dragged down the mountain, chinking the gaps with mud mixed with straw. It was a primitive existence. The winters in Montana were a lethal force. In the winter of 1886, known as the Big Die-Up, the temperature plummeted to 40 degrees below zero and stayed there. The wind howled like a banshee, driving snow through the smallest cracks in the walls. Cattle froze standing up, their breath solidifying in their lungs. Harvey spent days in the saddle, face wrapped in wool, hunting for strays and drifts that reached his stirrups. He saw carcasses piled in ravines, frozen solid, eyes eaten out by ravens. The brutality of nature reinforced his worldview. The universe was indifferent, and only the strong remained warm. During these formative years in the Little Rockies, Harvey began associating with a man named George Curry. Flat-nosed George was a rustler, a charmer, and a mentor in the art of illicit gain. Harvey looked up to Curry, seeing in him the freedom he craved. The brothers began to operate on the fringes of the law, branding mavericks, unmarked calves, that strayed from the massive herds of the DHS Ranch, a corporate giant that dominated the local range. To Harvey, this was not theft. It was leveling the playing field. The DHS was owned by distant capitalists who knew nothing of the frostbite and the mud. Taking their beef was a tax for living on the land. Under George Curry's tutelage, Harvey honed his skills with a running iron, altering brands with the precision of an artist. He also adopted the surname Curry as an alias, a nod to the man who taught him the trade, though locals still knew him as a Logan. The tension with Pike Landuski began as a low hum. Landuski had a reputation as a bully, a man who used his size and influence to intimidate the smaller ranchers. Harvey Logan, however, was constitutionally incapable of being intimidated. The friction started over trivial matters. Fence lines, water rights, the casual disrespect of a glance held too long in the local saloon. Landuski referred to the Logans as hard cases and trash, insults that burned Harvey's pride like acid. Pike was a man of the old frontier, used to settling disputes with his fists, and he viewed the smaller, darker Harvey with contempt. He did not see the coiled spring inside the younger man, the lethal pressure building behind Harvey's stoic expression. In the summer of 1892, the conflict escalated from words to legal harassment. Landuski, using his connections, accused the Logans of rustling. It was a common tactic to drive out competition, but it cornered the brothers. Harvey's resentment grew into a tangible thing, a dark companion that rode with him everywhere. He began to practice with his Colt .45 revolver incessantly. He would ride at a full gallop, firing at fence posts, refining his aim until the gun felt like an extension of his hand. He learned to shoot from the hip, to fire across his body, to reload by feel. He was preparing for a war he knew was coming. The turning point for Harvey's disposition came when the law enforcement of the region, heavily influenced by the cattle barons and men like Landuski, began to target the small outfits aggressively. Harvey saw sheriff stars not as symbols of justice, but as badges of oppression. He watched friends get arrested on trumped-up charges, saw homesteads burned, and saw the wealthy insulate themselves with hired guns. His moral compass broke, the needle spinning wildly before settling on a new north. loyalty to his brothers and violent retribution against anyone who threatened them. By the autumn of 1893, the Little Rockies were a powder keg. The Logans were running cattle, drinking hard, and refusing to back down. Harvey had grown into a man of few words but terrifying intensity. His eyes were dark pools that reflected no light, and when he entered a room, the temperature seemed to drop. He had gotten into minor scrapes, fistfights in the mud outside the saloon, arguments over card games, but he had kept the demon on a leash. However, the leash was fraying. Pike Landuski continued to provoke the brothers, confident in his brute strength and his status as the town's namesake. He underestimated the shift in the era. The time of the brawler was ending, the time of the gunman was beginning. As 1894 progressed, the atmosphere in Landuski became poisonous. The town was a collection of rough log structures huddled against the mountains, populated by miners who spent their days in the dark earth and their nights seeking oblivion in whiskey. Violence was the local dialect. Harvey walked these streets with a loaded revolver on his hip and a chip on his shoulder the size of the mountains looming above. He was 27 years old, a veteran of the cattle trails, a survivor of the frozen winters, and a man who had decided that he would never again be a victim. The final insult came not over cattle, but over a woman. The details were murmured in the saloons and shouted in the streets. An accusation involving Pike Landuski's stepdaughter and Harvey's brother, which resulted in assault charges filed against the Logans. Pike Landuski, enraged and vengeful, beat a handcuffed Lonnie Logan, dragging him through the dirt while the boy was helpless. When Harvey heard of this, something inside him snapped permanently. The code of the West allowed for violence, but beating a helpless man was a transgression that demanded blood. Harvey did not shout or rage when he heard the news. He simply checked the load in his revolver and sat in the dark of their cabin, listening to the wind rattle the door. December of 1894 brought deep snow to the gulches. The world was white and gray, silent and cold. The brothers continued to work their claim, but the work was mechanical. Harvey's mind was entirely occupied with the architecture of revenge. He knew Pike Landuski frequented the saloon owned by a man named Jew Jake. He knew Pike drank heavily and grew louder with every glass. Harvey waited. He was not a man to act on blind impulse. He waited for the moment when the universe would align the pieces. He sharpened his knife. He oiled his gun. He looked at his hands, scarred from barbed wire and rope burns, and accepted that they would soon be stained with something that would not wash off. The days leading up to Christmas were tense. The air in the town of Landuski felt charged, like the sky before a lightning strike. The locals sensed the collision course. Men stepped off the boardwalk when Harvey passed. They saw the set of his jaw and the deadness in his eyes. He was no longer just a cowboy or a rustler. He was a predator waiting for the prey to expose its throat. The migration from the cornfields of Iowa to the jagged peaks of Montana was complete. The boy who had cried at his mother's grave was dead, replaced by a man forged in the freezing winds of the high plains. A man who believed that the only law that mattered was the one that came out of the barrel of a .45. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the curtain was about to rise on a tragedy that would be written in red across the snow. One evening, close to the end of the year, Harvey sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sun dip behind the mountains. The light turned the snow to a bruised purple. He lit a cigarette, the flare of the match illuminating a face that had forgotten how to smile. He thought of his mother buried in the black Iowa dirt. He thought of the long, dusty trail from Texas. He thought of the freezing nights of the big die-up. And then he thought of Pike Landuski, laughing while he beat Lonnie. Harvey flicked the cigarette into the snow where it hissed and died. He stood up, adjusted his gun belt, and looked toward the town lights flickering in. The distance. The hardening was finished. The weapon was primed. Harvey Logan was ready to introduce the world to the monster it had created. The long fuse burned down to the powder, and the explosion was only days away. The peace of the Little Rockies was a lie, and Harvey Logan was the truth arriving to shatter it. December 27th, 1894. The morning sun rose over the Little Rocky Mountains with a pale, anemic light that offered no warmth to the frozen landscape of Montana. The temperature hovered near zero, turning the air into sharp needles in the lungs of anyone foolish enough to step outside without a scarf wrapped tight across their face. In the mining camp of Landuski, the snow lay packed hard on the single main street, churned into a brown slurry by the hooves of horses and the boots of miners, then refrozen into treacherous ruts. Smoke curled from the stovepipes of the log cabins, rising straight up into the stillness of the frigid atmosphere. The town was quiet, nursing the collective hangover of the Christmas celebrations from 2 days prior. But beneath the silence, a current of anticipation ran through the community like a vibration in the ground before a rock slide. Harvey Logan stood inside the rough shelter of a livery stable, adjusting the cinch on his saddle. The leather was stiff with cold, creaking loudly as he pulled the strap tight. His breath plumed in white clouds before him. He was dressed for the weather and for war, wearing a heavy wool coat, chaps, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the glare of the snow. Beside him stood his brother, Johnny Logan, checking the action on his own revolver. They did not speak. Words were unnecessary between them on this day. The grievances of the past months, the accusations of rustling, the insults, the assault on their brother Lonnie, had solidified into a singular purpose. They were not going to the saloon to drink whiskey for pleasure. They were going to find Powell Landuski. The walk from the livery to Jew Jake's saloon was short, but every step crunched loudly in the quiet street. Harvey walked with a measured pace, his boots breaking through the thin crust of ice on the boardwalk. He kept his hands free, his coat unbuttoned at the waist to allow easy access to his hands. The gun was a heavy, cold weight against his thigh, a tool he had cleaned and oiled with obsessive care the night before. He could feel the tension in his muscles, a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the freezing air. It was the adrenaline of a man walking toward a threshold he knew he could never cross back over. Jew Jake's saloon was a squat log structure that served as the social heart of the camp. The windows were frosted over from the heat inside, obscuring the view from the street. Harvey pushed the door open and the brothers stepped out of the biting cold into the thick, humid atmosphere of the barroom. The air inside was heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale beer, wet wool, and tobacco smoke. A cast-iron stove in the center of the room glowed red, radiating a fierce heat that warred with the drafts leaking through the chinking in the walls. The room was populated by the usual assortment of miners, drifters, and ranch hands. Conversation died down as the Logan brothers entered. Heads turned. Men held their glasses halfway to their mouths, eyes darting from Harvey to the far end of the bar. There, standing with a group of cronies, was Pike Landuski. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and thick-chested, wearing the confidence of a man who believed he owned the town that bore his name. His face, scarred and weathered, flushed with the heat of the stove and the whiskey he had been consuming since late morning. He saw Harvey enter, and a sneer twisted his features. Landuski did not fear the smaller man, he despised him. Harvey walked to the bar, his spurs jingling softly. He ordered a drink, his voice low and steady. The bartender, a man who had seen enough violence to recognize the signs of an imminent eruption, poured the whiskey with a shaking hand. Harvey did not drink it. He left the glass on the wood, the amber liquid trembling slightly from the vibrations of the room. He turned his back to the bar and looked directly at Landuski. The distance between them was less than 20 feet, a gulf filled with smoke and hostility. Landuski spoke first, his voice booming in the confined space. He made a derogatory comment about the Logans, a slur intended to provoke and belittle. He called them thieves and cowards, laughing as he looked to his friends for validation about the assault on Lonnie. The laughter was harsh, grating against Harvey's nerves. Harvey did not shout back. He simply walked toward Landuski. The movement was smooth, predatory. The crowd parted instantly, men scrambling to get out of the line of fire, knocking over chairs and spilling drinks in their haste to reach the walls. When Harvey reached Landuski, the large miner straightened up, towering over him. Pike expected words or perhaps a clumsy swing he could easily deflect. Instead, Harvey unleashed a fury that had been compressing inside him for years. He struck Landuski in the face with a right cross that carried the full weight of his body behind it. The sound of the impact was a sickening crack, the sound of knuckles meeting bone. Landuski's head snapped back, blood spraying from his nose in a fine mist. Before Landuski could recover, Harvey hit him again and then again. This was not a boxing match. It was an execution of rage. Harvey's fists were hammers, driving into Landuski's eyes, his mouth, his ribs. The larger man stumbled back, his arms flailing, trying to grab hold of Harvey, to use his superior weight to crush him. But Harvey was too fast. He ducked under a wild haymaker and drove a fist into Landuski's solar plexus, forcing the air from his lungs in a wheezing gasp. Pike doubled over and Harvey brought his knee up into the man's face, shattering cartilage and splitting the skin over the cheekbone. Blood poured down Landuski's face, blinding him in one eye. He roared in pain and frustration, a guttural sound like a wounded bear. He managed to grapple with Harvey, wrapping his thick arms around the smaller man's shoulders, trying to bear hug him into submission. They crashed into a table, splintering the wood and sending cards and poker chips flying across the floor. They rolled in the sawdust, a tangle of limbs and grunts. Harvey fought with the ferocity of a wild animal, biting, gouging, and striking anywhere he could. He broke Landuski's hold and scrambled to his feet, breathing hard, his knuckles split and bleeding. Landuski staggered up, his face a ruin of red pulp. He realized that his size was not enough, that the man standing before him intended to beat him to death. Panic replaced the arrogance in his eyes. His hand went to the heavy coat he wore, reaching for the semi-automatic pistol he carried. A modern weapon, more complex than the simple revolvers most men carried. He struggled to draw it, his fingers slick with his own blood, the hammer catching on the lining of his pocket. Harvey saw the motion. The time for fists was over, stepped back, his hand blurring as it swept his coat aside and seized Jim Thornhill's pistol. The motion was practiced, fluid, and terrifyingly fast. There was no hesitation, no moment of moral calculation. Harvey leveled the weapon at Landuski's chest. Landuski finally jerked his gun free, bringing it up to fire. The mechanics of the moment were unforgiving. Harvey squeezed the trigger. The roar of the pistol was deafening in the small room, a thunderclap that shook the dust from the rafters. The muzzle flash illuminated the dim interior for a split second. The heavy slug struck Pike Landuski squarely in the head. The impact was catastrophic. The bullet entered the skull, destroying the brain instantly. Landuski's head snapped back with violent force. His legs simply ceased to function. He did not slump. He collapsed, dropping to the floor like a puppet with its strings severed. His heavy body hit the planks with a thud that vibrated through the boots of every man in the room. His pistol clattered from his hand, sliding away across the sawdust unfired. Silence slammed into the room, absolute and heavy. The only sound was the ringing in the ears of the onlookers and the crackle of the wood in the stove. Smoke from the gunshot hung in the air, a pungent gray cloud drifting slowly toward the ceiling. Harvey stood over the body, his gun still raised, smoke drifting lazily from the barrel. His chest heaved as he sucked in oxygen. He looked down at the man who had tormented his family, the man who was the king of the Little Rockies. Pike Landuski was now just a heap of bloody clothes and cooling flesh. The snow outside was white, but the floor here was stained dark red. Johnny Logan moved to his brother's side, his own gun drawn, covering the room. He looked at the stunned crowd, daring anyone to object. No one moved. The men in the saloon knew that the balance of power had just shifted violently. The era of the fistfight was dead. The era of the gunman had arrived. They looked at Harvey not with contempt but with fear. They saw the lack of remorse in his eyes. They saw a man who had crossed a line and found he was comfortable on the other side. Harvey lowered the hammer of Thornhill's pistol carefully, listening to the mechanical click. He did not holster the weapon. He looked at the bartender who stood frozen with a rag in his hand. Harvey nodded once, a gesture that was both a farewell and a warning. Then he turned and walked toward the door. He stepped over a broken chair, his boots leaving bloody prints on the floorboards. Johnny followed, walking backward to keep his eyes on the crowd until they reached the exit. They stepped out into the freezing air of the street. The cold hit Harvey like a physical blow, freezing the sweat on his face. The town was still quiet, the gunshot muffled by the thick logs of the saloon walls. A dog barked in the distance, a lonely rhythmic sound. Harvey looked at his hands. They were trembling. Now, not from fear, but from the crash of adrenaline leaving his system. His knuckles were raw and swollen, smeared with Pike Landuski's blood. He wiped them on his coat, leaving dark streaks on the wool. They walked back to the horses at the livery stable. Harvey checked the cinch again, purely out of habit. He swung into the saddle, the leather groaning under his weight. He looked back at the saloon one last time. The door opened and a few men spilled out, shouting for the doctor, though they knew it was useless. The shouts were thin and panicked in the vast, cold landscape. Harvey turned his horse toward the mountains. He knew there would be no trial that he could win. The law in this part of the country was owned by men like Landuski, and killing their king meant a death sentence. He was an outlaw now. The word settled over him, heavy and permanent. He spurred the horse, and the animal leaped forward, kicking up clods of frozen snow. They rode out of Landuski, leaving the town and the dead man behind. As they ascended the trail into the timber, the trees closed in around them, dark sentinels against the white snow. The wind picked up, moaning through the pine needles. Harvey felt a strange clarity. The ambiguity of his life was gone. He was no longer a rancher trying to make a go of it. He was a killer on the run. The path ahead was narrow and violent. He touched the handle of his gun, feeling the cold steel. It was the only thing he could trust now. The news of the killing spread fast. Telegraph wires hummed with the story. Pike Landuski, the tough man of the mountains, beaten and gunned down by the quiet Logan boy. The narrative began to take shape, painting Harvey as a cold-blooded desperado. But up in the high passes, as the brothers made camp that night under the stars, the reality was simpler. Harvey sat by the fire, cleaning his gun again. He looked into the flames and saw the future. It was a dark tunnel illuminated only by muzzle flashes. He had pulled the trigger, and the echo would not fade until he was in the ground himself. The killing of Pike Landuski was the catalyst. It stripped away the veneer of civilization Harvey had tried to maintain. He accepted the wilderness not just as a place to live, but as a state of being. He was a creature of the wild now, hunted and dangerous. The savage end of Pike Landuski was the savage beginning of Kid Curry. The sun set on the 27th of December, burying the world in darkness, and Harvey Logan rode deeper into the night, ready for whatever came next. January 1896. The winter in Montana held the land in a rigid grip, the temperatures dropping well below freezing and staying there for weeks without relief. The snow in the valleys of the Little Rocky Mountains was thigh-deep on a man and belly-deep on a horse, with a crust of ice on the top that sliced into the legs of any animal forced to travel through it. The wind came down from the north with a consistent, piercing velocity that found every gap in a heavy wool coat. It was a hostile season, one that killed the weak and tested the endurance of the strong. On this particular afternoon, the T-Hook Ranch sat isolated in the white expanse, a collection of sturdy log buildings located near the Missouri River. The ranch was the property of James Winters, a man who had once been friendly enough with the local population, but had firmly aligned himself with the cattle interests and the faction that opposed the Logan brothers. Winters was a hard man, much like the late Pike, Landuski, and he made no secret of his disdain for the Logans. He had taken possession of the T-Hook, a place the Logans felt they had a claim to, and he held it like a fortress. Rumors had traveled through the frozen gulches that Winters was providing information to the law, acting as a set of eyes and ears for the marshals who were hunting Harvey Logan. Harvey Logan and his brother Johnny Logan rode toward the T-Hook Ranch as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. They were not alone, accompanied by their brother Lonnie Logan. The three men moved their horses slowly through the heavy drifts. The animals labored, their breath ejecting in thick steam clouds that froze on their muzzles. The riders wore heavy sheepskin coats and hats pulled low, their faces wrapped in scarves to prevent frostbite. Ice crystals formed on their eyelashes. They did not ride to the T-Hook for a social call. The feud between the Logans and Winters had festered since the killing of Pike Landuski. Winters had reportedly dug up the body of Pike Landuski to prove he was shot in the back, a claim that infuriated the Logans, who maintained it was a fair fight. The animosity was physical and immediate. The Logans intended to confront Winters to settle the dispute. They carried Winchester repeating rifles across their saddles, the metal of the receivers cold enough to burn bare skin. As they approached the ranch buildings, the silence of the valley was absolute. There were no birds, no rustle of small game. The only sounds were the creak of saddle leather and the crunch of hooves breaking through the ice crust. They rode openly, not expecting Winters to be prepared for an assault in such debilitating weather. This was a tactical error. James Winters was a cautious man, and he knew the Logans were in the area. He kept a double-barreled shotgun and a high-caliber rifle within reach at all times. The riders reached the perimeter of the ranch yard. The main house was a low structure with thick walls, defensible and solid. A corral stood to one side, the rails burdened with snow. Harvey signaled for the group to spread out slightly. They advanced toward the house. James Winters was inside. He saw the movement through a window, spotting the dark shapes of the riders against the stark white background. He did not hesitate or call out a challenge. He recognized the riders by their bearing and their horses. He knew that if they reached the door, he would be a dead man. Winters grabbed his rifle, a heavy weapon capable of accuracy at long range, and moved to a defensive position. He stepped out the back door or perhaps fired from a window. The accounts vary on his exact location, but the result was the same. He had the advantage of cover and surprise. The first shot cracked through the cold air with a sharp, flat report that echoed off the surrounding hills. The bullet missed Harvey, snapping past his head and burying itself in a fence post or the snow beyond. The horses panicked, rearing and plunging in the deep drifts. The sudden noise shattered the stillness. Harvey and Johnny fought to control their mounts, their hands gripping the reins while they tried to bring their rifles to bear. Winters worked the lever of his rifle and fired again. He was shooting with the calm precision of a man defending his life. The Logans returned fire, their Winchesters popping rapidly. Bullets slammed into the logs of the ranch house, sending splinters of wood flying into the snow. The smell of smokeless powder and black powder mixed with the clean scent of the frost. It was a chaotic skirmish, fought at close range in difficult terrain. The horses were large targets, and the deep snow made them slow and clumsy. Harvey shouted orders, his voice thin in the vast air. He tried to flank the house, urging his horse through a drift. Johnny Logan, younger and perhaps more reckless, stayed closer to the front. He fired at the flashes of smoke coming from Winter's position. Johnny was a capable gunman, but he was exposed. He sat tall in the saddle, a dark silhouette against the white field. James Winters sighted in on Johnny. He tracked the movement of the horse, led the target slightly, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The bullet struck Johnny Logan in the torso. It was a devastating hit. The heavy slug punched through the layers of wool and sheepskin, tearing into the soft tissue beneath. It shattered a rib and ravaged his internal organs before exiting the other side. The impact knocked Johnny backward. He lost his grip on the reins and the rifle. He toppled from the saddle, hitting the ground with a dull thud. His body disappeared into the snow, leaving a disturbed patch of white that quickly turned crimson. Harvey saw his brother fall. The sight triggered a reaction of pure, desperate violence. He spurred his horse toward where Johnny lay, firing his rifle with one hand until the magazine clicked empty. He screamed Johnny's name. The horse floundered in the snow, unable to reach the fallen man quickly enough. Winters continued to fire, the bullets kicking up sprays of snow around Harvey's horse. The situation was untenable. To stay was suicide. Johnny Logan lay in the snow, the cold seeping into his wound. The shock was immediate. His blood pumped out onto the ice, steaming in the freezing air. He tried to rise, but his legs refused to obey. The pain was a hot, searing presence in his gut. He looked up at the gray sky. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. The cold of the Montana winter began to numb his extremities, competing with the massive trauma of the gunshot wound. Harvey realized he could not reach Johnny without being cut down himself. The volume of fire from the house was too accurate. Winters had the range and the cover. Danny Howland shouted at Harvey, urging him to pull back. Reluctantly, with a rage that burned in his throat like bile, Harvey turned his horse. They retreated to the cover of a nearby coulee, a depression in the land that offered protection from Winters' rifle. From the safety of the coulee, Harvey watched the ranch yard. He reloaded his Winchester, his fingers stiff and clumsy with cold. He waited, hoping to see Johnny move, to see him crawl towards safety. But the dark shape in the snow remained still. The red stain grew larger, a stark contrast to the pristine white. James Winters did not come out. He stayed in his fortress, weapon ready, watching the body of his enemy. He knew better than to expose himself while Harvey Logan was still alive and nearby. The standoff lasted as the afternoon light began to fade. The temperature dropped further as the sun touched the horizon. Harvey Logan sat on his horse, shivering uncontrollably. It was not just the cold. It was the adrenaline crash and the dawning realization of loss. Johnny was not just a brother. He was a limb, a part of Harvey's own identity. They had survived the death of their parents, the harsh aunt in Missouri, the cattle drives, and the fights in Landuski together. Now Johnny was bleeding to death 50 yards away, and Harvey was powerless to stop it. Eventually, the reality of the situation forced Harvey to withdraw. They could not storm the house without heavy casualties. They rode away from the T-hook, the horses trudging through the snow, leaving Johnny Logan behind. It was the hardest thing Harvey had ever done. He did not look back. He fixed his eyes on the horizon, his face a mask of frozen sweat and grim determination. Johnny Logan died alone in the snow. The exact time of his death was unrecorded, but it was likely quick, hastened by the extreme cold and the severity of the wound. His body lay stiff and frozen until the authorities or Winters himself retrieved it. The death of Johnny Logan was the final severance of Harvey's ties to humanity. If the killing of Pike Landuski had made him an outlaw, The death of Johnny made him a monster. Harvey rode to a safe house, a remote cabin used by the gang. He did not speak for days. He sat in the corner, cleaning his guns repeatedly. The grief did not manifest as weeping. It manifested as a cold, hard hatred. He blamed the law, he blamed the cattle barons, he blamed James Winters, but mostly he blamed the system that protected men like Winters and hunted men like the Logans. He decided then that he would not just survive, he would wage a war. The news of the shootout at the T-Hook spread. It was another headline, another chapter in the growing legend of the Curry Gang. But for Harvey, it was not a story. It was a physical amputation. The loss of his brother removed the last check on his violent impulses. Johnny had been the younger brother, the one Harvey protected. With that mission failed, Harvey had no purpose other than vengeance. In the weeks that followed, Harvey Logan returned to the area. He scouted the T-Hook from a distance, watching the house through a spyglass. He wanted Winters to show his face. But Winters was smart. He stayed low, surrounded by hired guns. Harvey's patience was infinite, but his opportunities were scarce. The law was closing in, emboldened by the victory at the T-Hook. Marshals poured into the territory, sensing blood. Harvey moved his operations. He drifted south toward the hole-in-the-wall country of Wyoming, a natural fortress of red cliffs and hidden valleys that served as a sanctuary for outlaws. He rode with a new intensity. He recruited harder men. He planned bolder crimes. The death of Johnny Logan had liberated him from fear. He no longer cared if he lived or died, as long as he took as many lawmen with him as possible. The winter of 1896 gave way to a muddy, wet spring. The snow melted, revealing the carcasses of cattle that had died in the drifts. The land was scarred and ugly. Harvey Logan looked at the world and saw only targets. He began to ride with the Wild Bunch, associating with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, but Harvey was different from them. Cassidy was a thief who preferred not to kill. Harvey was a killer who happened to steal. The memory of Johnny lying in the snow at the T-Hook never left him. It was a visual that played on a loop in his mind every time he closed his eyes. The white snow, the red blood, the stillness of the body, it fueled him. It was the coal in the furnace of his rage. He stopped referring to himself as Harvey Logan to most people. He was Kid Curry now, fully and completely. The name Harvey Logan belonged to a boy who had a brother. Kid Curry was a man who had nothing. He began to practice his shooting with even more fanaticism. He wasted hundreds of rounds of ammunition shooting at moving targets, shooting from beneath his horse, shooting with his left hand. He perfected the cross-draw. He filed the sights of his revolvers to prevent them from snagging on his holster. He modified his weapons for speed and lethality. He was turning himself into a machine designed for one purpose: to kill the men who stood behind badges. The T-Hook Ranch incident was the catalyst for the escalation of violence that would define the next several years of the American West. It was the moment the gentleman bandit archetype died for the Curry Gang, replaced by a ruthless paramilitary approach to crime. They were not Robin Hoods. They were an insurgent force fighting a private war against society. As the summer of 1896 approached, Kid Curry was ready to unleash this new level of violence. He had a list of names in his head. James Winters was on it. Every sheriff in Montana was on it. The operators of the railroads were on it. He rode south, leaving the grave of his brother behind in the frozen Montana earth, but carrying the ghost with him. The T-Hook had taken Johnny, but it had given the world the true Kid Curry, a man hollowed out by grief and filled with gunpowder. The blood in the snow had dried, but the blood on his hands was just beginning to accumulate. The isolation of the outlaw life deepened. Harvey avoided towns unless necessary. He camped in the high brush, sleeping lightly. He trusted no one outside of his immediate circle. The betrayal of the law, the unfairness of the fight, the image of Winters shooting from the safety of a warm house while Johnny died in the cold. These were the bricks that built the wall around his psyche. He became a man of silence, his voice rarely rising above a murmur, his movements economical and precise. The chapter of the T-Hook Ranch closed with the burial of Johnny Logan in a small, wind-blown cemetery. But the story it started was far from over. It was the prologue to a spree of robberies and murders that would span 5 states. The snows of January 1896 melted into the rivers, but the cold remained in Harvey Logan's heart, a permanent winter that no summer sun could thaw. He was a weapon now, cocked and loaded, pointing directly at the heart of the law. June 2nd, 1899. The Union Pacific Overland Flyer No. 1 sat hissing in the dark rain at Wilcox, Wyoming, a metal beast crippled by dynamite and stripped of its gold. The robbery itself was a mechanical operation, executed with the precision of men who treated felony as a trade. But the aftermath was a chaotic struggle against the elements. Harvey Logan, now fully embracing the identity of Kid Curry, rode north into the blackness of the Wyoming night. He was accompanied by the Sundance Kid and flat-nosed George Curry. They carried heavy sacks of unsigned banknotes and gold coin, the weight of the loot adding to the burden of their horses. The weather turned violent immediately following the heist, as if the sky itself intended to wash the tracks from the earth. Rain fell in sheets, turning the high plains into a quagmire of gumbo mud that sucked at hooves and boots with equal tenacity. The trio pushed their mounts hard, crossing the Laramie Mountains in a deluge that soaked through their oilskin slickers and chilled their bones. Harvey rode with a grim focus. The adrenaline of the explosion and the intimidation of the train crew had faded, replaced by the cold logic of evasion. He knew the Union Pacific would not absorb this loss quietly. The railroad possessed infinite resources, and the telegraph wires were already humming with descriptions of the bandits. They needed to reach the rugged sanctuary of the hole-in-the-wall country, a geological fortress of red rock and box canyons where a few men with rifles could hold off an army. By June 4th, the gang crossed the swollen North Platte River near Casper. The water was high, brown with silt, and moving with dangerous velocity. They forced their horses into the current, the animals swimming frantically against the pull of the river. Harvey held his rifle high above his head, keeping the mechanism dry. They scrambled up the far bank, water streaming from their clothes, the horses heaving for air. They were tired, wet, and hungry, but they did not stop. Harvey knew that stopping was a luxury afforded only to the innocent. Behind them, the law was organizing. Sheriff Josiah Hazen of Converse County took charge of the pursuit. Hazen was not a paper administrator. He was a man of the territory, respected for his tenacity and his ability to read the land. He assembled a posse that included relentless trackers and detectives, men who knew the difference between a cow track and a shod horse ridden by a fugitive. Hazen took the robbery as a personal affront to the order of his county. He pushed his men forward, cutting for sign in the mud, ignoring the rain and the fatigue. He was a hunter closing the distance, driven by a duty that would soon lead him into a fatal intersection with Harvey Logan's rifle. On the morning of June 5th, 1899, the outlaws reached the vicinity of Teapot Creek, approximately 30 miles north of Casper. The terrain here was broken and hostile, a landscape of sagebrush, sandstone ridges, and deep washouts carved by flash floods. The ground was slick, the mud clinging to everything. The horses were nearing exhaustion. Harvey sensed the pursuit. He could feel the pressure of the posse behind them, a phantom weight on his spine. He scouted the area, looking for a defensible position. They needed to rest the horses and dry their weapons, but the open ground offered no safety. They found a defensive spot in a deep, rocky gully near the creek bed. The washout provided natural cover, the banks rising high enough to shield a man and a horse. Boulders and scrub brush offered camouflage. Harvey dismounted, his boots sinking into the wet red clay. He pulled his Winchester from the scabbard. It was a model 1892 chambered in the powerful 4440 cartridge, a weapon he knew intimately. He wiped the receiver with a rag, ensuring the action was clear of grit. He checked the magazine tube. It was full. The sun broke through the clouds, steaming the moisture from the sagebrush. The air smelled of wet earth and pine resin. Harvey positioned himself near the rim of the washout, peering back the way they had come. He did not have to wait long. In the distance, movement flickered against the gray-green of the hills. Riders. They were moving methodically, scanning the ground. Sheriff Hazen was in the lead, riding a dark horse, his posture alert. He had cut their trail. Harvey watched them come. He did not feel fear. He felt a cold, mechanical calculation. There were too many of them to fight in the open. The only way to break the pursuit was to cut off the head. He watched Hazen, identifying him as the leader by his position and his demeanor. The sheriff was the primary threat. If the sheriff fell, the posse would hesitate. That hesitation would be the door through which the gang could escape. The posse spotted the fresh tracks leading into the washout. Hazen signaled his men. They dismounted, sensing the trap but compelled to check the ground. They tied their horses and advanced on foot, rifles at the ready. Hazen moved with confidence, believing he had the bandits cornered. He did not know he was walking into the sights of a man who had long ago decided that killing a lawman was no different than killing a coyote. Harvey rested the barrel of his Winchester on a rock, using his hat to cushion the metal. He adjusted his sights for the distance, which was less than 200 yards. He slowed his breathing. The world narrowed down to the notch of the rear sight and the blade of the front sight. Hazen was walking steadily, his eyes scanning the brush. He was a brave man, walking toward danger to protect the property of a railroad corporation. Harvey did not care about bravery. He cared about survival. The silence of the creek bed was absolute for a moment, the wind dying down as if holding its breath. Then Harvey squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The report was a sharp crack that shattered the stillness. The bullet, a 200-grain slug of lead moving at high velocity, bridged the gap between the outlaw and the sheriff in a fraction of a second. It struck Sheriff Josiah Hazen in the abdomen. The impact stopped Hazen in his tracks. The bullet tore through the heavy fabric of his coat and vest, punching into the soft tissue of his gut. It ravaged his intestines, severing arteries and rupturing organs before lodging near the spine. Hazen dropped his rifle and doubled over, clutching his stomach. He fell to his knees, then collapsed onto the wet ground. The shock was immediate. His face turned the color of ash. The rest of the posse scrambled for cover as Harvey and the others opened up with a withering barrage of fire. Bullets kicked up spurts of mud and chipped rock around the lawmen. The air filled with the sharp, acrid scent of smokeless powder. The outlaws fired rapidly, working the levers of their rifles, with blurring speed, creating a wall of lead that pinned the deputies down. The posse returned fire, but they were shooting blind into the shadows of the washout. They could not see the gunman, only the puffs of smoke and the muzzle flashes. Hazen lay in the mud, the pain radiating from his center in blinding waves. A gut shot was a cruel way to die. It was not instant. It was a slow leakage of life, a poisoning of the blood, a horrific descent into agony. He tried to crawl, but his legs refused to respond. He called out to his men, his voice thin and strained. Two of the deputies, Dr. J.F. Leeper and Detective Joe LaForce, tried to reach him, crawling on their bellies through the sagebrush while bullets snapped overhead like angry insects. Harvey saw the men trying to rescue the sheriff. He fired at them, the bullets striking inches from their heads, forcing them to press their faces into the dirt. He was in total control of the engagement. He moved to a new position, firing from a new, different angle to keep them confused. He was not just suppressing them, he was hunting them. He wanted them to know that to advance was to die. The firefight lasted for an undetermined amount of time, perhaps an hour, perhaps less. The sun beat down on the scene, heating the rocks. Hazen's blood soaked into the Wyoming soil, turning the clay a dark, rusty red. The posse was paralyzed. They could not advance without exposing themselves to the deadly accurate fire coming from the washout. They could not retreat without abandoning their dying leader. They were checkmated by the ferocity of Kid Curry. Harvey signaled to Sundance and George. They had bought enough time. The posse was pinned, demoralized, and leaderless. It was time to vanish. They moved back to their horses, keeping low behind the ridge of the gully. They mounted up, the animals skittish from the noise of the gunfire. They rode out the back of the washout, using the terrain to screen their movement. They spurred the horses into a gallop, putting distance between themselves and the carnage at Teapot Creek. Back at the ambush site, the firing from the outlaws ceased. The silence returned, heavier than before. The deputies waited, fearing a trick. Finally, they crept forward, finding the washout empty. They rushed to Hazen. The sheriff was conscious but fading fast. His breathing was shallow and ragged. His hands were slick with his own blood. They lifted him carefully, but every movement caused him excruciating pain. There was no doctor nearby, no hospital that could repair the devastation in his abdomen. They managed to transport Hazen to a nearby ranch, and eventually a spring wagon was brought to carry him back to Douglas. The journey was a torture of bumps and jolts. Josiah Hazen fought to stay alive, his constitution strong, but the damage was catastrophic. Peritonitis set in quickly. The infection spread through his system, fevers spiking, delirium taking hold. He died 24 hours later, on June 6, 1899. He left behind a family and a community that mourned him, another victim sacrificed on the altar of Harvey Logan's freedom. Harvey did not look back as they rode deeper into the wilderness. He did not know if Hazen was dead or merely wounded, and it did not alter his trajectory. The act was functional. He had removed an obstacle, but the killing of Hazen changed the texture of the pursuit. Before, they were robbers. Now they were cop killers. The distinction was significant. The state of Wyoming, the Union Pacific, and the federal government would not stop now. The bounty on their heads increased. The gloves were off. The gang rode hard for the next 2 days, crossing the jagged Badlands. They wrapped the hooves of their horses in gunny sacks to mask their tracks. They rode through streams to break the scent for the dogs. They slept in shifts, one man always watching the back trail with a rifle across his knees. Harvey felt the change in the atmosphere. The world was shrinking. There were fewer places to hide. The civilization he despised was encroaching, bringing with it telegraphs, telephones, and more lawmen. They reached the sanctuary of the hole in the wall, navigating the narrow, hidden path that led up the red rock face. Here they were safe for the moment. They could rest. They counted the loot from the Wilcox train, thousands of dollars in unsigned banknotes. It was a fortune, but it was blood money. Harvey sat by the campfire, the light flickering on his face. He cleaned his rifle again. He ran a patch through the bore, checking the rifling. This weapon had killed a sheriff. It was a tool of his trade, and his trade was death. The murder of Josiah Hazen solidified Kid Curry's reputation as the most dangerous member of the Wild Bunch. Butch Cassidy might have been the brains and Sundance the stylist, but Curry was the executioner. He was the one who did the dirty work when the talk failed. He was the one who did not hesitate. In the camps and saloons of the Outlaw Trail, men spoke his name with a mixture of awe and terror. He was the tiger in the grass, the rattlesnake under the rock. Harvey looked at the stars above the Wyoming canyon. They were cold and distant, indifferent to the suffering of men. He thought of Pike Landuski. He thought of his brother Johnny rotting in the ground. And now, he thought of the man he had just gutted in Teapot Creek. The list was growing. The trail behind him was paved with bodies. He knew how this story would end. There would be no retirement, no farm in South America. There would only be a final violent collision with the inevitable. He checked the load in his revolver. 6 rounds. He checked the Winchester. Full magazine. He lay back on his saddle blanket, listening to the coyotes howl in the distance. They sounded like lost souls screaming in the dark. Harvey closed his eyes, but sleep was thin and brittle. He was a man at war with the world, and the world was beginning to fight back with everything it had. The killing of Sheriff Hazen was a tactical victory, but it was a strategic escalation that brought the end closer. The rain returned that night, washing the blood into the soil of Teapot Creek. But the stain on Harvey Logan's soul was permanent. He was no longer just running. He was daring the world to stop him. And for the moment, in the high, wild places of the West, there was no one who could. July 16th, 1899. The high desert sun hammered down on the broken topography of the New Mexico territory, baking the red earth until it radiated heat like the open door of a furnace. The air was dry, stripping moisture from the skin and cracking the lips of the 3 men huddled in the deep, scrub-choked ravine known as Turkey Creek Canyon. Harvey Logan, Elsie Lay, and Sam Ketchum sat in the uneasy shade of a sandstone overhang, their horses tied nearby in a thicket of pinon and cedar. They were tired men, their eyes rimmed with red dust, their bodies aching from days of hard riding. The heavy saddlebags resting on the ground near their boots contained the proceeds from the robbery of the Colorado and Southern train near Folsom 5 days earlier. It was a significant haul, but the weight of the gold and banknotes was matched by the weight of the pursuit that dogged their trail. The terrain around them was a tactical nightmare, a maze of steep canyon walls, jagged rocks, and dense brush that offered concealment but limited lines of sight. Harvey Logan sat with his back against the stone, his Winchester rifle across his lap. He did not relax. While Ketchum and Lay tended to a small fire to boil coffee, Harvey watched the rim of the canyon. He knew the pattern of the law. They were not dealing with local town constables who would turn back at the county line. They were being hunted by a dedicated posse led by Sheriff Ed Farr of Huerfano County, Colorado. Farr was a relentless tracker, a man who took his oath of office with a seriousness that bordered on religious fervor. He had crossed the territorial line into New Mexico without hesitation, following the tracks of the outlaws through the mountains and across the plains. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the silence of the canyon broke. The sound was not a gunshot, but the clatter of a horseshoe striking stone. It was a distant, rhythmic noise that carried clearly in the thin air. Harvey signaled to the others instantly. The coffee pot was abandoned. Ketchum and Lay grabbed their rifles, their movements stiff from fatigue but practiced. They moved away from the fire, seeking the cover of the large boulders that littered the canyon floor. Harvey moved higher, scrambling up a slope of loose scree to gain a vantage point. He settled behind a slab of granite, the heat of the rock pressing through his shirt. Below, the posse emerged from the brush. There were 7 or 8 of them riding cautiously. Sheriff Ed Farr rode in the lead, his eyes scanning the ground. He saw the smoke from the campfire drifting lazily into the sky. He halted his horse and raised a hand. The deputies fanned out, unlimbering their weapons. They knew they were close. The air grew thick with tension, the kind of static charge that precedes a violent storm. Farr dismounted, handing his reins to a horseholder. He advanced on foot, a Winchester lever-action rifle in his hands. He was a large target, a man who refused to hide behind his subordinates. The engagement began with a sudden violence that shattered the afternoon. Harvey Logan did not wait for a surrender order. He saw the sheriff advancing, saw the intent in the man's posture. Harvey sighted in on the lead figures and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the canyon, the echo rolling back and forth off the walls. The bullet kicked up dirt near Farr's feet, a warning shot or a near miss that signaled the start of the carnage. The canyon floor erupted in gunfire. The posse returned fire immediately, their bullets chipping stone and shredding the leaves of the oak brush. The noise was deafening, a continuous roar of exploding gunpowder. Smoke began to fill the depression, hanging low in the stagnant air, obscuring targets and burning the throat. Harvey worked the lever of his rifle with mechanical precision. He fired, ejected the spent casing, and fired again. He was not shooting to suppress, he was shooting to kill. He targeted the men who looked the most capable, the ones who were moving forward rather than diving for cover. Sheriff Ed Farr, realizing the outlaws had the high ground and the advantage of position, showed remarkable courage. He did not retreat. He pressed forward, moving from rock to rock, trying to get a clear shot at the men hidden in the boulders. He spotted Sam Ketchum, who was firing from behind a fallen log. Farr raised his rifle and fired. The bullet struck Sam Ketchum in the left arm. The heavy slug smashed into the bone, shattering the humerus and turning the limb into a ruin of torn muscle and splinters. The impact spun Ketchum around, dropping him to the ground. He cried out, the sound raw and guttural, but he did not drop his weapon. He struggled to a sitting position, propping his rifle on his knees, trying to load it with one hand. The blood flowed freely from his sleeve, soaking into the dry dust of the canyon floor. Lay saw Ketchum fall and directed his fire toward Farr. The sheriff was pinned down, bullets snapping the air around his head. Farr was in a duel with 3 desperate men who had nothing to lose. He fired back, his shots well aimed but failing to find a vital mark. The distance was short, perhaps 50 yards, a range where a rifle was devastatingly effective. Harvey Logan shifted his position, sliding down the scree to get a better angle. He moved like a ghost through the smoke. He saw Farr exposed for a brief second as the sheriff moved between cover. Harvey leveled his rifle. At the same moment, a deputy named Love fired at Lay. The bullet caught Lay in the chest and shoulder, a heavy impact that knocked the wind out of him and sent him crashing into the dirt. Lay was down, bleeding heavily, his breath coming in wet, ragged gasps. With 2 of his companions hit, Harvey was effectively alone in the fight. A lesser man might have surrendered or fled immediately. Harvey Logan did neither. The pressure focused him. He saw Sheriff Farr rising to fire again. Harvey adjusted his aim. He tracked the movement of the lawman's torso. He exhaled and pulled the trigger. The bullet struck Sheriff Ed Farr, shattering the joint before traveling into his chest. The velocity of the round carried it through the vital organs. It severed the arteries near the heart. Farr dropped his rifle. He stood for a moment, a look of surprise crossing his face before his knees buckled. He fell forward, face down in the dirt. He tried to speak, to call out to his men, but his mouth filled with blood. The light went out of his eyes within moments. The sheriff of Huerfano County was dead. The death of the sheriff stalled the posse's advance. The deputies saw their leader fall and hesitated. The volume of fire from the lawmen slackened. Harvey seized the initiative. He poured fire into their position, keeping their heads down. He moved to where Ketchum and Lay were lying. Both men were badly wounded. Ketchum's arm was useless weight, his face gray with shock. Lay was coughing blood, his chest rising and falling with difficulty. "We have to move," Harvey said, his voice flat. He did not offer comfort. He offered survival. They managed to get to their horses. The animals were terrified by the noise, pulling at their tethers, eyes wide and rolling. Harvey helped Ketchum into the saddle, the wounded man gritting his teeth against the agony of the movement. Lay pulled himself up, swaying dangerously. They were a broken force, bleeding and battered, but they were still mobile. Harvey mounted his horse and turned back toward the posse. He fired 3 rapid shots, forcing the deputies to stay behind their cover. Then he spurred his horse up the steep trail leading out of the canyon. The climb was brutal. The horses scrambled on the loose rock, their hooves slipping. Blood dripped from the wounded men, leaving a trail for anyone to follow. The escape from Turkey Creek was a grim procession. They rode into the high country, seeking the roughest terrain possible to discourage pursuit. The sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the landscape. The temperature dropped rapidly, the heat of the day replaced by a mountain chill. This drop in temperature was dangerous for men in shock. Ketchum groaned with every step of the horse, the pain in his shattered arm becoming a blinding constant. They rode until the moon rose, a silver sliver in the black sky. They stopped in a dense thicket of aspen. Harvey helped the men down. He examined their wounds by the light of a match. Ketchum's arm was a mess, the bone protruding through the skin. It needed a doctor or an amputation, neither of which Harvey could provide. Lay's chest wound was serious, but the bullet had missed the heart. He was lucky if breathing pink froth could be called luck. Harvey bound their wounds with strips of cloth torn from their shirts. The fabric was dirty and he knew infection was a certainty. He boiled water in a tin cup and forced them to drink. He cleaned his rifle again. The metal smelled of burnt powder. He sat watch while the others drifted into a feverish sleep. Back in the canyon, the surviving members of the posse recovered the body of Sheriff Farr. They wrapped him in a blanket and tied him over the saddle of a pack horse. The mood was somber and angry. They had lost a good man. The victory of wounding the outlaws felt hollow against the weight of the corpse they carried. They retreated to Folsom to regroup and send telegrams. The wires buzzed with the news. Sheriff Farr killed. Outlaws wounded but at large. For the next few days, Harvey led the wounded men through the wilderness. It was a slow, agonizing journey. Ketchum's condition deteriorated rapidly. The infection in his arm turned the flesh black. He smelled of rot. He became delirious, talking to people who weren't there. Harvey knew Ketchum was a liability. He was slowing them down and he was dying. On the 4th day, near a ranch in the Cimarron area, Harvey made the decision. He could not drag a dying man any further. They left Sam Ketchum at a sheep camp, propped against a tree with a canteen of water. It was not an act of mercy. It was an act of logistics. Harvey knew the law would find him. Ketchum was captured shortly after by the pursuing posse. He was taken to Santa Fe where his arm was amputated, but the gangrene had already spread to his blood. He died a slow, miserable death in the penitentiary hospital, never revealing Harvey's location. Elsie Lay was also separated from Harvey, eventually cornered and captured weeks later after another shootout. He survived his wounds to stand trial and serve a long sentence. Harvey Logan was now truly alone. He had ridden into Turkey Creek with 2 partners and ridden out with ghosts. The loot from the Folsom robbery was still in his possession, but the cost had been absolute. He drifted into the vastness of the landscape, a solitary figure moving through the shadows. The encounter at Turkey Creek had stripped away the last vestiges of the gang's structure. There was no more Wild Bunch in this moment. There was only Kid Curry. He rode south and west, moving toward Arizona. He avoided the towns. He lived on jerky and water from muddy springs. He watched the horizon constantly. The face of Sheriff Farr falling into the dirt was etched into his memory, not as a source of guilt, but as a reminder of the stakes. The law was willing to die to stop him. He had to be willing to kill everyone to stay free. The environment of the Southwest became his only companion. The cactus, the rattlesnakes, the scorpions. These were things he understood. They struck when threatened. They survived by being dangerous. Harvey felt a kinship with the land. He was becoming as hard and unforgiving as the sandstone cliffs. By late 1899, the name Kid Curry was synonymous with death. The newspapers printed lurid accounts of the Turkey Creek battle, often exaggerating the details, but the core truth remained. Harvey Logan was a machine that destroyed anyone who tried to arrest him. He had now killed a miner, a sheriff in Wyoming, and a sheriff in Colorado. The borders of the states meant nothing to him. Harvey checked his back trail every hour. He slept with his revolver in his hand. He ate with his eyes on the door. The paranoia was a survival mechanism. He knew the law enforcement of 3 territories was coordinating to find him. Men like detectives Charles Siringo and W.H. Reno were analyzing his habits, predicting his movements. They were treating him like a rogue wolf. The carnage at Turkey Creek Canyon was a turning point. It proved that Harvey could not be taken by a direct assault. It forced the lawmen to change their tactics. They began to set traps, to use informants, to close the net slowly. But Harvey was always moving. He was a shark in a sea of dust. If he stopped, he died. As the weeks turned into months, Harvey Logan rode toward the Arizona territory. He needed new associates, men who were hard enough to ride with him. He would find them, or he would operate alone. It made no difference. The result would always be the same. When the law came, the guns would come out. The chapter of Turkey Creek closed with the silence of the high desert returning to the canyon. The rains washed away the blood of Ed Farr and the blood of Sam Ketchum. The casings from the Winchesters rusted in the dirt, but the violence that happened there sent ripples through the West. It was a signal that the end of the outlaw era would not be a quiet fading away. It would be a screaming, bloody fight to the last bullet. Harvey Logan rode on, carrying the darkness with him, a man who had declared war on the 20th century, late March 1900. The Arizona Territory sat under a sky of relentless polished blue, a vast dome of heat that pressed down on the volcanic rock and sagebrush of Apache County. This was a land of extremes, where the high desert plateau was cut by deep arroyos, and the wind carried the dust of 1,000 miles. St. John's, a small settlement populated largely by Mormon families, existed in a fragile truce with this environment. The town was quiet, dusty, and isolated, a place where strangers were noticed immediately and remembered. Harvey Logan and his associate William News Carver had ridden into this region seeking anonymity after the violent events in New Mexico. They were men operating under the heavy burden of fugitive status, carrying the stolen banknotes from the Wilcox robbery. These notes were their lifeline and their greatest liability. In the days leading up to the 28th, they had made the tactical error of passing some of these unsigned bills in the local mercantile. The currency was distinct, raising the suspicions of the local merchants and the law enforcement officials who monitored the flow of money in the territory. A report reached the sheriff's office in St. John's regarding 2 suspicious strangers camped out in the cedars near the Little Colorado River. Sheriff Edward Beeler, a man charged with maintaining order in a county larger than some eastern states, organized a response. He did not lead the initial reconnaissance himself, but deputized 2 local men, Andrew Gibbons and Frank LeSueur. Both deputies were young, capable, and deeply rooted in the community. They were not professional manhunters in the mold of a Pinkerton detective or a U.S. Marshal. They were citizens fulfilling a civic duty, men who expected to confront rustlers or drifters, not the most dangerous members of the wild bunch. Gibbons and LeSueur rode out of St. John's on the morning of March 27th. They were well armed, carrying Winchester, rifles and revolvers, and mounted on sturdy horses accustomed to the rough terrain. They picked up the trail of the suspects quickly. The tracks led away from the town, winding through the scrub brush and heading toward the rough country where the river cut through the plateau. The deputies rode with a steady pace, their eyes scanning the ground, reading the story written in the dust. They noted the shod hooves of the outlaws' mounts, the spacing of the tracks indicating a leisurely pace. The suspects did not seem to know they were being pursued. Harvey Logan and Bill Carver had established a camp in a secluded hollow surrounded by juniper trees and sandstone outcrops. The location offered a degree of concealment and a defensive perimeter. They were vigilant men. Paranoia was a survival trait they had honed over years of living outside the law. They did not sleep soundly. They ate their meals with their rifles across their knees. On the morning of the 28th, the air was crisp, the sun just beginning to warm the rocks. Harvey was tending to his horse, checking the animal's hooves for stones. Carver was cleaning a coffee pot with sand. The silence of the high desert was a deceptive thing. It amplified sound. The clatter of shod hooves on rock traveled for miles. Harvey stopped his work abruptly. He stood still, his head cocked to the side, listening. He heard it again. The distinct rhythmic impact of iron on stone. It was coming from the east, from the direction of St. John's. He signaled to Carver. There were no words exchanged. They knew the drill. They gathered their weapons immediately. The two outlaws moved away from their campfire, seeking the high ground. They climbed a ridge that overlooked the approach to their campsite. They positioned themselves behind large boulders, the rough volcanic stone providing excellent cover. They waited. The sun climbed higher, casting sharp black shadows across the canyon floor. Harvey rested the barrel of his rifle on the rock, his finger resting on the trigger guard. He watched the trail. Gibbons and Le Sueur rode into view a short time later. They were moving cautiously now, sensing they were close to their quarry. They spoke in low tones, their voices carried away by the wind. They saw the remnants of the campfire, the flattened grass where bedrolls had been. They did not see the two rifle barrels tracking their movement from the ridge above. The deputies advanced, their eyes focused on the camp, looking for signs of the men they intended to question. Harvey Logan watched the two lawmen through the sights of his Winchester. He saw their badges glinting in the sunlight. He saw the uncertainty in their posture. He did not see men. He saw obstacles. He saw the potential for a jail cell, a trial, and a hangman's noose. The calculation was instantaneous. There would be no warning. There would be no demand for surrender. To offer a chance to surrender was to offer a chance for the enemy to shoot back. Harvey glanced at Carver. Carver nodded. They selected their targets. Harvey took the lead rider, Andrew Gibbons. Carver took the second, Frank Le Sueur. The range was short, perhaps 40 yards. It was a distance at which a miss was unlikely for men of their skill. The morning stillness shattered with the roar of the rifles. Harvey's shot struck Andrew Gibbons in the chest. The heavy bullet punched through his coat and vest, smashing into the sternum and driving deep into the thoracic cavity. The impact knocked Gibbons backward out of his saddle. He did not have time to cry out. He hit the ground hard, his rifle flying from his hand. Simultaneously, Carver fired at Le Sueur. The bullet caught the deputy in the shoulder, spinning him around. Le Sueur's horse reared, terrified by the noise and the sudden shift in weight. Le Sueur fought to stay mounted, his left arm useless, blood spreading rapidly across his shirt. He tried to draw his revolver with his right hand, but the horse was bucking wildly. Harvey worked the lever of his Winchester, ejecting the spent shell and chambering a fresh round. He shifted his aim to the struggling Le Sueur. He fired again. This shot struck the deputy in the head. The violence of the impact was absolute. Le Sueur collapsed from the saddle, his body falling limp into the dust. The horses, now riderless and panicked, bolted away into the brush, their reins trailing behind them. Silence returned to the canyon, but it was a heavy, ringing silence. The smell of smokeless powder hung in the air, sharp and chemical. Harvey and Carver did not move immediately. They stayed behind their cover, watching the bodies for any sign of movement. Gibbons lay on his back, staring up at the blue sky. his chest still. LeSueur was face down, a pool of blood widening in the sand around his head. After a full minute of observation, the outlaws descended from the ridge. They walked slowly, weapons raised, approaching the fallen lawmen. They moved with the caution of predators inspecting a kill. Harvey reached Gibbons first. He kicked the deputy's boot. There was no response. He knelt and checked for a pulse. There was none. Andrew Gibbons was dead. Carver checked LeSueur. The head wound was catastrophic. Frank LeSueur was gone. The ambush had been perfectly executed. The lawman had never fired a shot. It was a slaughter, a cold-blooded removal of a threat. Harvey stood over the bodies. He felt no remorse. In his mind, these men had come to hunt him. They had accepted the risk when they pinned on the badges. He was simply the better hunter. He began to go through their pockets. He took their ammunition. He took their watches. He took anything that could be of use or value. It was a grim harvest, a violation of the dead that emphasized his complete detachment from societal norms. They retrieved the deputy's rifles from the dirt. These were good weapons, Winchesters that could be sold or used. They caught the deputy's horses, which had not run far. The animals were calm now, grazing on the sparse grass, indifferent to the death of their riders. Harvey checked the saddlebags. He found food and supplies which they added to their own stores. The brutality of the scene was stark. Two young men, fathers and husbands, lay dead in the dirt of a remote canyon, killed for doing their job. Their bodies were left exposed to the elements. Harvey did not bury them. He did not cover them. He left them where they fell, a testament to his ruthlessness. This was a message to anyone else who might pick up his trail. Follow me. And this is where you end. Harvey and Carver mounted their own horses, leading the captured animals. They rode out of the canyon, heading deeper into the White Mountains. They moved quickly now, knowing that the failure of the deputies to return would trigger a massive response. The clock was ticking again. Back in St. John's, the hours passed with agonizing slowness for the families of the deputies. When Gibbons and LeSueur did not return by the evening of the 28th, fear began to set in. By the morning of the 29th, a search party was organized. It was a large group, composed of grim-faced men who feared the worst. The search party followed the tracks of the deputies. It did not take them long to find the site of the ambush. The scene they discovered was horrific. The bodies had been lying in the sun for over 24 hours. The insects had found them. The men of the search party, hardened frontiersmen, turned away in sickness and anger. They saw the lack of footprints around the deputies' positions, realizing instantly that they had been gunned down without a chance to defend themselves. The news of the St. John's murders swept through the Arizona territory like a wildfire. It was not just a killing, it was an atrocity. The names Andrew Gibbons and Frank LeSueur became rallying cries for law enforcement. The governor of Arizona authorized a large reward. The Mormon community of St. John's mourned, but their grief quickly turned to a cold resolve for justice. Harvey, Logan, and Bill Carver rode hard to the south and east, aiming for the border of New Mexico again. They knew the heat in Arizona would be unbearable. They had to keep moving. They crossed the high passes where the snow still lingered in the shadows. They rode through forests of ponderosa pine, the massive trees standing like pillars in a cathedral. The beauty of the landscape meant nothing to Harvey. It was just terrain to be traversed, cover to be utilized. As they rode, Harvey cleaned his rifle in the saddle. He wiped the dust from the receiver. He checked the action. He knew that the killing of Gibbons and LeSueur had escalated his situation significantly. He was now wanted for murder in 3 territories. The federal government was involved. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency was pouring resources into the hunt. He was becoming the most hunted man in America. The ambush at St. John's demonstrated a shift in Harvey's tactics. At the T-hook, He had fought a standoff. At Turkey Creek, he had fought a running battle. Here he had set a trap and executed his pursuers. He was becoming more efficient, more lethal. He was stripping away the romanticism of the outlaw life and revealing the ugly, violent core of it. He was a professional killer ensuring his own survival. The psychological toll on Harvey was not visible on his face, but it existed in his actions. He spoke less, he slept less, he trusted no one. Even with Carver, there was a distance. Every man was a potential traitor. Every shadow was a potential assassin. The world was shrinking into a tunnel with a gun at the end of it. They reached a safe house in New Mexico, a remote ranch owned by a sympathizer. They traded the captured horses and guns for fresh mounts and supplies. They did not stay long. Harvey knew that stasis was death. They had to keep moving. They drifted toward the San Simon Valley, moving through the chaotic landscape of the borderlands. The memory of the two deputies lying in the dirt did not haunt Harvey. It was filed away with the memories of Pike Landuski, Johnny Logan, Josiah Hazen, and Ed Farr. They were casualties of war. Harvey viewed himself as a soldier in a conflict against a system that sought to crush him. The morality of the situation was irrelevant to him. The only thing that was significant was that he was still breathing, and they were not. The St. John's ambush also marked the beginning of the end for the loose association of outlaws known as the Wild Bunch. The pressure brought on by these killings made it impossible for the gang to operate as a large unit. They had to splinter, to scatter like quail. Harvey was forcing them into isolation by the sheer magnitude of his violence. Men like Butch Cassidy, who preferred to avoid bloodshed, found it increasingly difficult to associate with Curry. His reputation was a magnet for lawmen. In the weeks following the murders, the posse from St. John's trailed the outlaws for hundreds of miles, displaying a tenacity that surprised Harvey. They recovered the stolen horses and some of the equipment, but the men themselves slipped through the net. The vastness of the American West was still the greatest ally of the fugitive. There were simply too many canyons, too many mountains, too many places to disappear. Harvey Logan rode on, a dark figure against the setting sun. The dust of Arizona coated his clothes. The blood of the deputies was on his hands, invisible but permanent. He was Kid Curry, the man who did not hesitate, the man who shot first. The St. John's ambush was a brutal chapter in a book written in blood, a demonstration of the cold logic of the gunman. As March turned to April in the year 1900, Harvey Logan was alive, free, and more dangerous than he had ever been. The wilderness swallowed him up, hiding him from the justice of men but keeping him locked in. The prison of his own violent existence. April 5th, 1900. The San Simon Valley stretched out across the borderlands of Arizona and New Mexico, a vast basin of scrub brush and alkali dust trapped between the jagged spines of the Chiricahua and Pelanchillo Mountains. The landscape was deceptive, appearing flat from a distance but riddled with deep arroyos, dry washes, and rocky outcrops that could hide an army or a solitary assassin. The wind moved through the valley with a constant, abrasive force, carrying the grit of the desert into the eyes and lungs of any man foolish enough to traverse it during the heat of the day. The rustler sat high in the rocks of Triangle Canyon, a rugged defile that cut into the slopes of the mountains. He was not alone, accompanied by his associate, often identified as the darker-skinned, rough-edged Dave Atkins, though the lawmen tracking them were unsure of the second man's identity at the time. They had pushed a small herd of stolen cattle into the canyon, using the animals as bait as much as currency. The rustler knew they were being followed. He had seen the dust cloud tracking their movement for 2 days, a persistent smudge on the horizon that signaled the approach of experienced trackers. He did not run blindly. Instead, he chose his ground. The man leading the pursuit was George Scarbro. This name carried a heavy weight in the territory. Scarbro was not a local deputy or a frightened town constable. He was a stock detective for the Cattle Raisers Association, a former deputy marshal, and a gunman of significant repute. He was the man who had killed John Selman, the slayer of John Wesley Hardin. Scarbro was a professional, a man who hunted men for a living and did so with a terrifying efficiency. He was accompanied by a young, capable rancher named Walter DeHart. They rode with the confidence of men who believed in their own superiority, armed with modern rifles and the authority of the law. The rustler respected the reputation of George Scarbro, but he did not fear it. To the rustler, a reputation was just a story men told to frighten others, whereas a bullet was a physical reality that ignored prestige. The rustler positioned himself behind a cluster of granite boulders that offered a commanding view of the canyon floor. He settled his rifle into the crevice of the rock. He was using a high-powered rifle, likely a Winchester model 1895, a weapon capable of delivering a lethal payload at ranges far exceeding the older lever-action carbines. He checked the windage, noting the way the dust drifted across the canyon. He wiped the sweat from his eyes. The waiting was part of the work. Around noon, the sun stood directly overhead, eliminating shadows and flattening the depth perception of the terrain. George Scarbro and Walter DeHart rode into the mouth of Triangle Canyon. They were following the fresh sign of the cattle, the tracks deep and obvious in the soft sand of the wash. Scarbro rode in, the lead, his posture upright, his eyes scanning the brush. He expected an ambush, as any prudent lawman would, but the terrain gave him few options. To advance, he had to enter the chute. The rustler watched them come. He lay perfectly still, his body blending into the gray and brown stone. He breathed slowly, regulating his heart rate. He let them ride deeper into the trap, cutting off their easy retreat. He wanted them committed to the ground where he held the advantage. He centered his sights on Scarbro. He did not aim for the horse, he aimed for the man. This was not a warning, it was an assassination. The silence of the canyon broke with the crack of the rustler's rifle. The sound was sharp and singular, echoing violently off the canyon walls. The bullet missed Scarbro's torso by inches, perhaps pushed by a sudden gust of wind, and struck the ground near the horse's hooves, kicking up a spray of gravel. Scarbro and DeHart reacted instantly. They spurred their horses toward the cover of a large rock formation on the valley floor. Harvey worked the action of his rifle, the brass casing tumbling onto the stone next to him. He fired again, then a third time. The bullet snapped through the air, aggressive and searching. One of the shots struck DeHart's horse, sending the animal crashing to the ground. DeHart scrambled clear, dragging his rifle with him, and dove behind a boulder. Scarbro dismounted rapidly, slapping his horse to send it away, and took up a position near DeHart. The ambush had turned into a siege. The lawmen were pinned down in a depression on the canyon floor, surrounded by open ground. The rustler and Atkins held the high ground, protected by thick granite slabs. The geometry of the fight was simple and brutal. The rustler looked down the barrel of his rifle. He could see the boot of a man, the brim of a hat, the flash of a rifle barrel. He began to fire methodically, placing his shots to chip away the rock protection of his enemies. George Scarbro was a veteran fighter. He returned fire, his bullets striking the rocks near the rustler's head, sending stone splinters flying. But Scarbro was shooting uphill against the sun. He was at a severe tactical disadvantage. He called out to DeHart to watch the flank, trying to organize a defense. They were trapped. The heat began to build in the canyon, the rocks radiating the solar energy until the air shimmered. The rustler observed the pattern of Scarbro's movement. He noticed that the lawman had to expose himself slightly to fire effectively. The rustler shifted his position, crawling on his belly to a new vantage point a few yards to his left. This new angle opened up a sliver of visibility behind the rock where Scarbro was hiding. The rustler waited. He was patient. He knew that impatience got men killed. Minutes dragged into an hour. The firing was sporadic, a game of cat and mouse played with lead. Then Scarbro made a mistake. He shifted his leg to get better leverage for a shot. His right leg moved out from behind the cover of the boulder, exposed to the line of sight from the rustler's new position. The rustler squeezed the trigger. The heavy caliber bullet bridged the distance in a fraction of a second. It struck George Scarbro in the right leg, just above the shin. The projectile smashed into the heavy bone of the tibia. The impact was devastating. The bone did not just break, it shattered. The bullet tore through muscle, nerves, and arteries, exiting the other side and leaving a ruin of flesh in its wake. Scarbro cried out, a sound of shock and agony that carried up to the rim of the canyon. He collapsed, his leg folding uselessly beneath him. The structural integrity of the limb was gone. He rolled onto his back, clutching his thigh, the blood pumping dark and fast onto the sand. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, a white-hot spike driving into his central nervous system. Walter DeHart saw his partner go down. He scrambled to Scarbro's side, risking exposure to the deadly fire from above. He tried to drag the large man deeper into cover, but every movement caused Scarbro to scream. The leg was a mangled wreck. DeHart looked up at the cliffs, firing wildly to suppress the shooters, but he could not see them. He was fighting ghosts. The rustler watched the scene with cold detachment. He saw the lawman fall. He saw the panic in the younger man's movements. He did not cheer. He simply chambered another round. He kept firing, keeping DeHart pinned, preventing him from tending to the wound effectively. The rustler wanted the injury to do the work. He knew that in this terrain, a shattered leg was a death sentence. The afternoon wore on. The sun began to dip toward the western horizon, casting long shadows into the canyon. Scarbro lay in the dirt, his face gray, his body shaking with shock. He was bleeding out. He told DeHart to leave him, to ride for help. But DeHart refused to abandon him while the guns were still barking from the rim. The rustler and Atkins realized their ammunition was finite, and the darkness would soon cover the lawman's escape or reinforcement. They had achieved their objective. They had neutralized the primary threat. The rustler fired a few final rounds to keep heads down, then signaled to Atkins. They crawled backward, away from the rim, moving silently until they reached their horses tied in a draw behind the ridge. They mounted up and rode away, leaving the canyon to the gathering dusk. They did not ride fast. They rode with the assurance of men who had won the day. The rustler had faced one of the most dangerous men in the West and had broken him. He did not need to stand over the body to know the result. He had felt the impact through the sights of his rifle. Back in the canyon, silence returned. Walter DeHart waited until he was sure the outlaws were gone. He improvised a tourniquet for Scarbro's leg, but the damage was extensive. The limb was destroyed. He managed to get the wounded man onto a horse, a task that required immense effort and caused Scarbro excruciating torture. They began the long, slow journey out of the mountains, heading toward the railroad at San Simon. George Scarbro suffered through the night. The cold descended, biting into his shock-ravaged body. The pain was constant, a grinding, tearing sensation with every step the horse took. He drifted in and out of consciousness. He spoke of his family, of the men he had killed, of the irony of dying in a ditch after surviving so many duels. They reached San Simon the next day. A train was flagged down and Scarbro was transported to Deming, New Mexico, where there was a hospital and surgeons. The doctors looked at the leg and shook their heads. The bone was pulverized. The infection had already begun to set in. They amputated the leg in a desperate attempt to save his life, but the shock and the blood loss were too great. George Scarbro, the man who tamed El Paso, the man who killed Selman, died on April 6, 1900. He did not die in a blaze of glory or a quick draw contest in the street. He died in a hospital bed, delirious with fever, killed by a rifleman he never clearly saw. The news of Scarborough's death hit the law enforcement community like a hammer blow. He was supposed to be invincible. If George Scarbro could be hunted down and sniped like a deer, then no badge was safe. The name Kid Curry was whispered with a new level of dread. He was not just a robber, he was a tactician who dismantled his pursuers. The rustler rode deep into the Arizona mountains. He heard the news of Scarborough's death days later from a contact at a remote ranch. He showed no emotion. He ate his beans and listened. In his mind, the ledger was balanced. Scarborough had come for him, and Scarborough had paid the price. It was the simple arithmetic of the frontier. The assassination in Triangle Canyon marked a specific evolution in the rustler's methodology. He was moving away from the chaotic brawls of his youth. He was becoming a guerrilla fighter. He used the land, the range of his weapon, and the psychology of fear. He understood that killing a leader like Scarborough would paralyze the pursuit for a time. It would make the next posse hesitate at the mouth of the next canyon. The death of Scarborough also severed the last link the law had to the old ways. The days of the lone lawman riding into the Badlands to bring in the outlaw were ending. The industrial age was creeping in, but the rustler was proving that a man with a rifle and the will to use it could still hold the world at bay. The rustler cleaned his Winchester that night with obsessive care. He ran the oiled patch through the bore until it came out white. He polished the stock. This rifle was his only true friend. It did not judge him, it did not betray him. It simply sent death where he pointed it. He looked at the fire and thought of the next move. The circle was closing, but he was not done. The killing of George Scarborough was a statement. It was a declaration that the rustler recognized no authority above his own survival. He had killed a legend, and in doing so he had become a phantom, a nightmare that rode the high ridges of the Southwest. The law would come again, with more men and more guns, but the rustler would be waiting. He was the kid, and the game was far from over. May 26, 1900. The Red Rock Canyons of Grand County, Utah, burned under the glare of the late spring sun. The heat here was a physical weight, pressing down on the sandstone cliffs and the winding ribbon of the Grand River. It was a landscape of violent geology where the earth had been twisted, lifted, and eroded into a maze of towering spires and deep, shadowed gorges. Into this unforgiving terrain rode Harvey Logan, the man now universally feared as Kid Curry. He was not running. He was not looking for a place to hide or a bank to rob. He was looking for blood. The motivation for this journey was personal and singular. The previous months had stripped Harvey of the few human connections he still valued. In February, his brother Lonnie Logan had been cornered and killed by a posse at their aunt's home in Missouri. Lonnie had died in the snow, shot down like a rabid dog. Then in April, the man who had taught Harvey the trade of the outlaw, George Flatnose, Curry, had been killed near Thompson, Utah. George had been gunned down by a posse led by the sheriff of Grand County, Jesse Tyler. To Harvey Logan, these were not lawful acts of justice. They were acts of war against his family. The death of George Curry required a response, and the code Harvey lived by dictated that the response must be written in the blood of the man responsible. Harvey rode with a companion from the Outlaw Trail. They moved through the Book Cliffs, a rugged escarpment that ran for miles, offering a perfect vantage point to watch the movements in the valley below. They were heavily armed. Harvey carried his Winchester rifle across his saddle, the stock worn smooth by constant handling. His revolvers were checked and rechecked. He had ridden hundreds of miles to reach this specific patch of Utah dirt. He was not interested in the scenery. He was interested in the movements of Sheriff Jesse Tyler. Sheriff Tyler was a brave man, perhaps too brave for his own longevity. He knew the outlaws were in the area. Following the death of George Curry, Tyler had vowed to finish the job and wipe out the rest of the gang. He had been relentless, organizing patrols, checking water holes, and following up on every report of stolen horses or strange campfires. On this morning, Tyler was riding with his deputy, Sam Jenkins. They were moving through the brush along the Grand River, searching for the sign of the men who had sworn to kill them. They were the hunters, or so they believed. They did not understand that the dynamic had shifted. They were no longer the predators. They were the bait. Harvey watched the river bottom from a high ridge. The willows and cottonwoods along the water offered dense cover. He saw the two figures riding slowly through the breaks. He recognized Tyler. He knew the sheriff's horse, and he knew the sheriff's bearing. The sight of the lawman triggered a cold, focused rage in Harvey. This was the man who had put a bullet in George Curry. This was the representation of the system that had taken everything from the Logan family. Harvey signaled to his companion. They turned their horses down a narrow, rocky trail that led toward the river. The descent was steep and treacherous. The horses slid on the loose shale, their hooves striking sparks against the stone. Harvey did not look down. His eyes were fixed on the green strip of vegetation where the lawmen were patrolling. He planned the engagement in his mind. He would not give them a chance to surrender. He would not give them a chance to speak. He wanted them to feel the same terror and pain that Lonnie and George had felt in their final moments. By early afternoon, the outlaws reached the floor of the canyon. The heat was more intense here, trapped between the canyon walls. The air smelled of sagebrush, river mud, and the dry, dusty scent of the sandstone. They tied their horses in a thicket of tamarisk, ensuring the animals were silent and hidden. They advanced on foot, moving through the undergrowth with the stealth of Apache warriors. Harvey carried his rifle at the ready, his finger resting along the trigger guard. He moved slowly, placing his feet carefully to avoid snapping dry twigs. Sheriff Tyler and Deputy Jenkins stopped near a bend in the river to water their horses. The water moved sluggishly, brown with silt. The lawmen were tired. They had been in the saddle since dawn. Tyler wiped his face with a bandana, scanning the cliffs above. He felt exposed. The terrain was too broken, too full of blind spots. He turned to Jenkins and made a comment about the heat. Jenkins nodded, adjusting his hat. They were good men, doing a hard job for little pay, driven by a sense of duty to the citizens of Moab. They did not know that they were standing in the center of a kill zone. Harvey Logan emerged from the brush 50 yards away. He did not shout a challenge. He did not call out for them to throw up their hands. He simply stepped out from behind a large cottonwood tree, raised his Winchester, and acquired his target. The sight picture settled on the chest of Sheriff Jesse Tyler. The crack of the rifle was a sudden, violent intrusion into the quiet afternoon. The bullet struck Tyler in the chest, punching through his vest and shirt. The impact was massive. Tyler was knocked backward, his feet leaving the ground. He landed hard in the mud of the riverbank. His horse reared, splashing water onto the dry ground, and bolted toward the trees. Deputy Jenkins reacted instantly. He was a veteran of frontier conflicts and did not freeze. He drew his revolver, turning toward the source of the gunshot. He saw the smoke drifting from the trees. He fired blindly in that direction, the bullet stripping leaves from a willow branch high above Harvey's head. Jenkins tried to move toward cover, diving behind a fallen log. Harvey worked the lever of his rifle. The brass casing ejected, spinning in the sunlight before landing in the dirt. He shifted his aim to Jenkins. The deputy was partially obscured by the log, but his shoulder and head were visible. Harvey breathed out. He squeezed the trigger again. The bullet struck the log, sending a shower of wood splinters into Jenkins' face. Jenkins flinched, raising his head slightly. That small movement was fatal. Harvey fired a third shot. This bullet caught Jenkins in the side of the neck, severing the major vessels and shattering the vertebrae. Jenkins collapsed behind the log, his gun falling from his hand into the mud. Silence returned to the river bottom, broken only by the sound of the water moving against the bank and the heavy, ragged breathing of Sheriff Tyler. Tyler was not dead yet. He lay on his back, staring up at the strip of blue sky between the canyon walls. His chest was a ruin. Every breath was a struggle, a gurgling gasp as his lungs filled with blood. He tried to reach for his own weapon, but his arms refused to obey his commands. Harvey Logan walked out of the trees. He did not run. He walked with a steady, deliberate pace. He approached the fallen sheriff. He looked down at the man who had killed George Curry. There was no pity in Harvey's eyes. There was only the blank, flat look of a man who had completed a transaction. Tyler looked up at him. Recognition flickered in the dying man's eyes. He knew who this was. He knew why this was happening. He tried to speak, perhaps to ask for mercy or to curse his killer, but only blood came out of his mouth. Harvey stood over him. He did not say a word. He aimed the rifle at Tyler's head. He pulled the trigger. The shot ended the sheriff's suffering and his life instantly. The body jerked once and then lay still. Harvey turned his attention to Deputy Jenkins. He walked over to the log. Jenkins was already gone, his eyes fixed on nothing, a pool of dark blood spreading into the soil beneath him. Harvey checked the body to be sure. He nudged Jenkins with the toe of his boot. The deputy was dead. The retribution was complete. In the span of a few minutes, the law enforcement leadership of Grand County had been decapitated. Harvey felt a strange emptiness. The rage that had driven him across the state borders had burned itself out, leaving only ash. Killing Tyler did not bring George back. It did not bring Lonnie back. It just added 2 more ghosts to the procession that followed him. Harvey and his companion gathered the lawmen's horses. They did not want the animals to starve or wander off. They took the weapons from the dead men. It was practical. Guns were tools, and tools were valuable. Harvey took Tyler's revolver, a heavy piece of steel that had likely fired the shot that killed George. He shoved it into his belt. It was a trophy, a grim memento of the vengeance he had exacted. They left the bodies where they fell. They knew that a search party would eventually come looking when the sheriff did not return to Moab. The discovery of the bodies would send a shockwave through the territory. It was one thing for outlaws to kill lawmen in a running fight or a botched robbery. It was another thing entirely for them to hunt the lawmen down and execute them. This was an assassination. It changed the rules of engagement. Harvey mounted his horse. The saddle leather was hot to the touch. He looked around the canyon one last time. The red walls seemed to close in on him. He felt the isolation of his position. He was an enemy of the state, an enemy of the railroads, and now a man who killed sheriffs for sport. There was no going back to a normal life. There was no possibility of amnesty. He had crossed the final line. They rode away from the river, heading east toward the Colorado border. The terrain became even more rugged, a land of high mesas and deep, dry washes. They rode in silence. The sun began to set, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and orange. The heat of the day radiated up from the ground, enveloping them in a dry warmth. Back in Moab, the sun went down and the town grew quiet. People waited for the sheriff to return. Wives looked out of windows. Deputies checked the street. When morning came and Tyler and Jenkins were still missing, the dread would turn to panic. A posse would ride out, following the tracks to the river. They would find the scene of the slaughter. They would see the cold precision of the kills. They would know that Kid Curry had been there. The killing of Jesse Tyler and Sam Jenkins marked the peak of Harvey Logan's violence. It was the moment he became the most dangerous man in the West. He was no longer just a thief. He was a terror. The newspapers would scream the headlines. Rewards would be doubled. But Harvey did not care about the papers or the money. He cared only about survival and the strange, dark honor of the outlaw code. In the days that followed, Harvey and his companion moved deep into the remote wilderness of the Uncompahgre Plateau. They avoided trails. They covered their tracks. They lived like wolves, sleeping in shifts, eating cold food. The exhilaration of the kill faded, replaced by the crushing reality of the fugitive life. Every man they saw was a potential threat. Every sound in the night was a potential posse. Harvey cleaned the Winchester rifle again. He sat by a small fire hidden in a deep ravine. The metal of the gun gleamed in the firelight. This weapon had killed 3 lawmen in less than a year. It was an extension of his will. He looked at his hands. They were steady. He felt no guilt. To him, the world was a violent place, and he was simply better at violence than the men who tried to stop him. The Retribution in Moab was a story that would be told in saloons and bunkhouses for decades. It solidified the legend of Kid Curry as a man who could not be stopped by normal means. It created a fear that permeated the law enforcement community. Men pinned on their badges with a little more hesitation. They rode into the canyons with a little more caution. They knew that somewhere out there in the vast empty spaces of the West, Harvey Logan was waiting. But for Harvey, the victory was hollow. He was alone in the dark, surrounded by enemies. The revenge he had sought so desperately had not healed him. It had only dug the hole deeper. He lay back on his saddle blanket, looking up at the stars. They were the same stars that had looked down on Iowa, on Montana, on New Mexico. They were indifferent to his crimes and his justifications. The killing of Sheriff Tyler was a tactical success, but a strategic disaster. It brought the full weight of the Pinkerton Agency and the federal government down on him. There would be no rest now. The hunt would be relentless. Harvey Logan had declared war on the 20th century, and the 20th century had infinite resources. He closed his eyes, but sleep was elusive. He saw the face of Pike Landuski. He saw the body of Johnny Logan in the snow. He saw Sheriff Hazen clutching his gut. He saw Ed Farr falling in the canyon. He saw Andrew Gibbons and Frank LeSueur in the dust. And now, he saw Jesse Tyler and Sam Jenkins lying in the mud of the Grand River. The gallery of the dead was full, but there was always room for one more. Harvey Logan drifted into a light doze, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. The wind blew through the canyon, whispering through the sagebrush. It sounded like voices. It sounded like the past trying to catch up to him. But Harvey was faster than the past. He would keep riding, keep shooting until the road ran out. The Retribution in Moab was over, but the long, bloody journey of Kid Curry was far from finished. The shadows lengthened, and the night took possession of the land, hiding the man who had become a monster in the pursuit of his own dark justice. December 13th, 1901. The geography of Harvey Logan's war had shifted dramatically. He was no longer in the vast, open silence of the Red Rock Canyons or the high alpine passes of the Rockies. He was in Knoxville, Tennessee, a city of brick and coal smoke, electric streetcars and crowded sidewalks. The wilderness that had protected him for a decade was gone, replaced by the grid of civilization. The air here tasted of soot and damp river mud. It was a claustrophobic environment for a man used to seeing the horizon in every direction, but it was also a place where a man with money could buy anonymity, or so he believed. Harvey was operating under the alias William Wilson. He had drifted east, far from the hunting grounds of the Pinkertons in Montana and Wyoming, seeking a respite from the constant pursuit. He wore a suit, a derby hat, and an overcoat, blending into the population of railroad workers, merchants, and travelers. However, the clothing could not disguise the nature of the man beneath it. His hands were scarred from ropes and reins. His eyes were constantly moving, scanning the room, checking the exits, assessing the threat level of every man who walked through the door. The predator was wearing the skin of a citizen, but the disguise was thin. On this particular Friday, the temperature was freezing, a damp cold that seeped through layers of wool. Harvey spent his time in the saloons and pool halls of the Bowery district, specifically a literal establishment known as Ike Jones's Saloon on Central Street. It was a loud, smoky room filled with the clatter of billiard balls, the clink of glass, and the murmur of men gambling. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and cheap tobacco. Harvey stood at a pool table, cue in hand. He was winning. He played with a sharp, aggressive style, clearing the table with a precision that drew attention. Attention was the one thing Harvey Logan could not afford. The unsigned banknotes from the Great Northern train robbery in Montana, a violent heist that had occurred in July near Wagner, were in his pockets. He had been passing them cautiously, but money that smelled of crime always left a trail. The local police had received reports of a suspicious stranger, a man who flashed large rolls of cash and had a temper that flared like a match strike. The reports described a man who fit the description of the notorious Western outlaw, though few in Knoxville believed such a figure would be in their city. 2 lawmen were assigned to investigate the disturbance and the reports of the suspicious gambler. They were William Dinwiddie and Robert Saylor. These men were not frontier sheriffs like Ed Farr or George Scarbro. They were city police officers accustomed to breaking up bar fights and arresting drunks. They carried billies and revolvers, but they operated with the assumption that their uniforms commanded respect. They did not know they were walking to confront a man who had killed lawmen in 3 different states and who viewed a police uniform as a target. Dinwiddie and Saylor entered Ike Jones's saloon in the late afternoon. The noise in the room dipped slightly as the patrons noticed the uniforms. Harvey Logan saw them instantly. He did not look up from the pool table, but his body went rigid. The muscles in his back tightened. He chalked his cue, the sound a dry rasp in the sudden quiet. He watched them in the reflection of the bar mirror. They were looking for him. The trap he had evaded in the mountains had finally closed in a pool hall in Tennessee. The officers approached the table. Saylor was the larger of the 2, a man who relied on his physical presence to intimidate. Dinwiddie was more cautious, his hand resting near his holster. They stopped a few feet from Harvey. Saylor asked him his name. Harvey replied with the alias, Wilson, his voice low and flat. The officers were not satisfied. They asked about the money. They asked where he was from. Harvey's answers were short, clipped, and hostile. The tension in the immediate vicinity spiked. The other patrons backed away, sensing the violence radiating from the small, dark-haired man at the table. Saylor moved to arrest him. He stepped forward, reaching out to grab Harvey's arm. It was a fatal miscalculation. Harvey dropped the pool cue. It hit the floor with a clatter. In the same motion, he spun towards Saylor. He did not go for his gun immediately. He struck Saylor with his fist, a hard, fast blow that staggered the big officer. The saloon erupted into chaos. Men shouted and scrambled for the doors, overturning chairs and tables in their panic to escape the blast radius. Dinwiddie drew his billy club, stepping in to subdue the suspect. He swung the heavy wood baton, aiming for Harvey's head. Harvey ducked, but the club grazed him. The pain was sharp, but it was fuel for the fire. Harvey grappled with Saylor. The 2 men locked in a violent embrace. Saylor was strong, and he managed to get a grip on Harvey's coat. They crashed into the bar, shattering bottles and sending liquor streaming across the wood. Harvey realized he could not win a wrestling match against 2 men. He needed the equalizer. He broke his right arm free from the grapple. His hand swept under his coat and found the grip of his Colt revolver. He drew the weapon in the tight confines of the clinch. The barrel was only inches from Robert Saylor's body. Harvey pulled the trigger. The gun roared in the enclosed space, a deafening explosion that stunned the room. The bullet struck Sailor in the chest. The impact blew the officer backward, his grip on Harvey failing. Sailor collapsed to the floor, blood spraying from the wound, coughing and gasping for air. Dinwiddie saw his partner fall. He drew his own revolver, leveling it at Harvey. But Harvey was faster. The Western gunman had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of the snapshot. He turned the Colt on. He fired. The bullet hit Dinwiddie in the side, punching through his uniform and into his abdomen. The officer grunted, the wind driven from him, and crumbled to his knees. He tried to raise his gun again, but his strength drained away with his blood. Harvey stood alone in the center of the carnage. The air was blue with smoke. The smell of cordite mixed with the spilled whiskey. 2 policemen lay on the floor, one dying, the other grievously wounded. The silence that followed the gunfire was heavy and terrifying. Harvey looked at the door. He knew the shots would draw the entire police force. He had to move. He ran for the back exit. He burst out of the saloon into the freezing December evening. The alleyway was dark. He could hear whistles blowing in the distance, the sound of boots pounding on the pavement. The city was waking up to the threat. Harvey ran toward the railroad tracks, hoping to catch a freight train to find a way out of the concrete maze. He reached the edge of a steep embankment overlooking 2nd Creek. The ground was slick with ice and mud. In the darkness, he misjudged the drop. He slipped. He tumbled down the ravine, crashing through brush and debris. He hit the rocks at the bottom hard. The impact stunned him. He felt a sharp pain in his side. He tried to stand, but the cold water of the creek soaked his clothes, freezing him instantly. He managed to crawl into a drainage pipe or a culvert to hide. He was hurt. He was wet. The temperature was dropping. He huddled in the dark, his teeth chattering, his hand gripping the revolver. He waited. He heard the voices of the search parties above. They were combing the area. They had lanterns. The beams of light cut through the darkness, sweeping over the brush. After evading arrest that night, Harvey Logan slipped out of Knoxville. The rain washed the streets clean, but the manhunt did not fade. He kept moving, trading alleys for rail yards and rail yards for back roads, staying ahead of the lanterns and the shouted orders. The search stretched on, and the law finally put hands on him outside the city. Shackled, soaked, and exhausted, he was hauled back toward Knoxville, and the town that had heard the gunfire got its first close look at the man who had turned a saloon into a battlefield. The deputies closed in. They were cautious, knowing he had escaped cages before and knowing a cornered man could still kill. He did not beg. He did not speak. He simply sat there, a broken machine that had not yet stopped turning. They hauled him in. Hands grabbed him, locking irons on his wrists, pushing him through shouting streets and into the hard light of the jail. Knoxville wanted a monster in a cell, and for the moment it got one. The capture of Kid Curry was a sensation. The news traveled across the country. The man who had terrorized the West, the man who had killed sheriffs and robbed trains, had been taken in a muddy creek in Tennessee. He was marched to the jail, surrounded by a mob of onlookers who wanted to see the monster. Both Robert Sailor and William Dinwiddie survived their wounds. They carried the scars for years, living long enough to watch the legend of Kid Curry swell beyond the Bowery. The gunfire did not kill them, but it turned Knoxville into another place that wanted Harvey Logan finished. Harvey sat in his cell in the Knoxville jail. The walls were stone and steel. There were guards watching him 24 hours a day. He was stripped of his weapons, his money, and his freedom. But even as he sat there, warming up from the freezing ordeal, his mind was not on the gallows. It was on the structure of the jail. He looked at the bars. He looked at the guards. He looked for the weakness. The Knoxville saloon slaughter was the end of his freedom, but it was not the end of his war. He had shot 2 more lawmen, adding to the grim tally. He had proven that he was deadly in any environment, from the high desert to the urban pool hall. As the year 1901 came to a close, Harvey Logan sat in a cage, a tiger waiting for the keeper to make a mistake. The public believed the story was over. They believed the hangman would have his day. They did not understand the depth of Harvey's resolve. He was not a man who accepted walls. He was a man who went through them. The brutality of the saloon fight lingered in the city's memory. The blood on the floor of Ike Jones's place was scrubbed away, but the stain remained. Harvey Logan had brought the violence of the frontier to their doorstep. He had shown them that civilization was a thin veneer, easily shattered by a .45 caliber bullet. Harvey waited. The trial loomed. The lawyers talked. The guards paced. And in the silence of his cell, Harvey Logan began to plan the impossible. He would not die in Tennessee. He would not die in a cell. He would die as he had lived, under the open sky, with a gun in his hand. The slaughter was done, but the final act was yet to be written. The capture was merely an intermission in a tragedy that had one chapter left to play. June 7, 1904. The night air in the high Rockies was thin and cold, biting into the lungs with every inhalation. West of the small, slumbering town of Parachute, Colorado, the steel rails of the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad glimmered faintly under the starlight. The silence of the valley was profound, a vast, empty quiet that pressed down on the sagebrush and the winding ribbon of the Colorado River. Lying in wait near the tracks, Harvey Logan was a shadow among shadows. He was a man worn down by a decade of constant motion, his face a map of deep lines and sun-damaged skin. But his eyes remained alert, scanning the darkness with the intensity of a nocturnal predator. He was accompanied by two men, their identities obscured by the night and history, figures who followed the legend of Kid Curry into the throat of danger. The distant rumble of the approaching train vibrated through the ground long before the headlight cut the darkness. It was the No. 5 westbound express, a heavy beast of iron and steam laboring up the grade. Harvey checked his weapons. The Colt revolver on his hip was a familiar weight, a cold comfort in a hostile world. The dynamite in his satchel was a volatile promise of violence. He did not feel fear. That emotion had been burned out of him years ago in the snows of Montana and the canyons of Utah. He felt only a grim, mechanical determination. This robbery was a necessity, a means to fund the endless flight from the civilization that sought to crush him. As the locomotive ground to a halt, obstructed by the signal fire or debris placed by the gang, Harvey moved. He boarded the engine cab with the fluidity of a younger man. The heat from the firebox was a sudden, intense blast against the chill of the night. The engineer and fireman, faces smeared with coal dust, looked up to see the bore of a revolver pointed at them. Harvey's command was a low growl, barely audible over the hissing steam. He forced them down from the cab, marching them along the gravel ballast toward the express car. The stones crunched loudly under their boots. The passengers in the coaches behind peered out into the darkness, sensing that something was wrong but seeing only the void. The express messenger, a man tasked with guarding the company's wealth, had barred the door. Harvey did not shout or plead. He placed the sticks of dynamite against the wood, lighting the fuse with a steady hand. He stepped back, shielding his eyes. The explosion was a thunderclap that rolled through the valley, echoing off the battlement mesa. Wood splinters rained down like hail. The door was gone, replaced by a jagged hole and billowing smoke. Harvey stepped into the car. The air was thick with the smell of nitrates and ozone. He moved to the safe. It was a stubborn iron box. He applied more dynamite. The second blast was even more violent, warping the steel plates and blowing the door across the car. They grabbed the loot, sacks of unsigned banknotes and gold coin. It was a chaotic harvest. Harvey shoved the money into bags, his movements jerky and fast. He knew the clock was ticking. The sound of the explosions would carry for miles. The telegraph wires would soon be humming. He jumped from the car, landing in the dirt. He signaled his men. They mounted their horses, animals that had been stolen from a nearby ranch, and spurred them into the night. The escape route led south across the Colorado River. The river was a formidable barrier, swollen with the meltwater from the high peaks. The black water moved with a terrifying speed, swirling in eddies and currents that could drag a horse under. Harvey drove his mount into the icy flow. The water rose to the saddle skirts, freezing his legs. The horse struggled, its hooves slipping on the unseen rocks of the riverbed. Harvey gripped the reins, his knuckles white. He could feel the power of the river trying to sweep him away, trying to drown him in the dark. They reached the far bank, scrambling up the mud, the horses heaving for breath. They rode into the battlement mesa, a rugged, unforgiving landscape of steep ridges, deep gulches, and dense thickets of oak brush and cedar. The terrain was a nightmare for travel. The ground was littered with loose shale that shifted underfoot, threatening to lame the horses with every step. Harvey led the way, navigating by the stars and the contours of the land. He pushed the pace, knowing that dawn would bring eyes. He rode with a stoic endurance, ignoring the fatigue that settled into his bones like lead. He was 40 years old, an old man by the standards of the Outlaw Trail, and his body was a catalog of old injuries. By the morning of June 8th, the alarm had been raised. The citizens of Garfield County were mobilizing. This was not the lawless frontier of the 1880s. This was the 20th century. Telephones rang. Sheriff Edward A. Stevens organized a posse that was efficient, heavily armed, and relentless. Among them were men like Raleigh Gardner, a deputy with the eyes of a hawk and the tenacity of a wolf. They picked up the trail at the river crossing. They saw the tracks leading into the high country. They tightened their cinches, checked their rifles, and began the ascent. Harvey and his men rode higher, seeking the cover of the timber. The sun rose, baking the moisture from the ground and heating the air. The insects began to buzz, a constant, irritating drone. The horses were flagging. They had been ridden hard without rest or grain. Harvey watched them stumble, their heads low. He knew they were losing the race. He scanned the horizon, looking for a defensible position, a place to make a stand if it came to that. He hoped to cross the divide and drop into the vastness of the uninhabited lands beyond. But the posse was closing the gap. On the morning of June 9th, the end began. The outlaws had stopped in a deep rocky depression near the head of a gulch to let the horses breathe. It was a poor position, offering limited sight lines, but they had no choice. The animals were done. Harvey sat on a rock, chewing on a piece of dried meat. He tasted the dust in his mouth. He heard a sound, the clatter of a rock rolling down a slope. He froze. He looked up. On the ridge above them, the posse appeared. They were silhouettes against the bright morning sky. They had cut the distance while the outlaws rested. There was a moment of absolute stillness, a heartbeat where the two groups looked at each other across the gulf of the law. Then, the world exploded. Harvey grabbed his Winchester. He did not seek cover immediately. He stood his ground, firing at the shapes on the ridge. The posse returned fire with a disciplined, overwhelming volume. The air around Harvey turned into a swarm of angry bees. Bullets struck the ground, kicking up geysers of dirt. They smacked into the rocks, whining as they ricocheted. The noise was deafening, a continuous roar that drowned out thought. Harvey worked the lever of his rifle, ejecting shells, firing, ejecting. He was fighting with the muscle memory of a lifetime. But the angle was wrong. The posse had the high ground. They poured fire into the depression. One of the outlaw's horses screamed a high, human-like sound as a bullet tore through its lungs. The animal collapsed, thrashing in the brush. Then the hammer fell. A bullet fired by rancher Rolla Gardner found its mark. It struck Harvey Logan in the left shoulder, smashing through the clavicle and scapula. The impact spun him around like a rag doll. The rifle flew from his hands. He hit the ground hard, the breath driven from his lungs. The pain was instant and absolute, a blinding supernova of agony that radiated from his shoulder down his arm and into his neck. He tried to rise. He reached for his rifle with his left hand, but the arm did not respond. It hung limp, a useless appendage of dead meat. The bone was shattered. The structural integrity of his shoulder was gone. He gasped, sucking in air mixed with dust. He realized with a cold, sickly clarity that he was crippled. He could not shoot a rifle. He could not ride a horse. He could not climb. His companions were returning fire, but they were pinned. They looked at Harvey. They saw the blood soaking his shirt, turning the fabric black. They saw the gray pallor of his skin. "Go," Harvey said. The word was a croak. "I'm finished. Don't wait for me." They looked at him, then at the ridge. Self-preservation took over. They grabbed their guns and scrambled up the opposite slope, disappearing into the dense oak brush. They left Harvey Logan alone in the killing jar. Harvey dragged himself behind a large boulder. The exertion caused black spots to dance in his vision. He sat up, leaning back against the rough stone. The gunfire slackened as the posse chased the fleeing men. Harvey was alone. The silence returned, heavier than before. He could hear his own heart beating, a ragged, thumping rhythm in his ears. He looked at his left arm. It was bleeding heavily, a steady, dark stream that pooled in the dirt between his legs. He knew what was coming. The posse would circle back. They would find him. They would see that he was wounded. They would capture him. He thought of the Knoxville jail. He thought of the cold, damp cell. He thought of the staring eyes of the guards. He thought of the humiliation of the trial. He thought of the rope, the noose, the drop. He would not give them that satisfaction. He was Kid Curry. He had lived by the gun and he would die by the gun. He had taken the lives of 9 men to stay free. He would not let them take his freedom now. He reached across his body with his right hand. He drew the Colt revolver. The metal was hot from the sun. It felt heavy, heavier than it ever had before. He checked the cylinder. He had rounds. He needed only one. He listened. He could hear the boots of the deputies crunching on the shale. They were coming down the slope. They were cautious, weapons raised. They were coming to collect the trophy. Harvey looked at the sky. It was a brilliant, achingly beautiful blue. A hawk circled high above, riding the thermals. It was free. Harvey closed his eyes for a second. He saw the faces of the dead. Pike Landuski, Johnny Logan, George Curry, Flat Nose, Lonnie. They were waiting for him. He opened his eyes. He pressed the muzzle of the revolver against his right temple. The steel dug into his skin. He did not tremble. His hand was steady. This was the final act of defiance. This was the tables turning. They thought they had him. They thought they had won. But he would deny them the prize. He took a breath. He held it. He squeezed the trigger. The shot was a dull thud in the open air. The bullet passed through his brain in a millisecond, extinguishing the consciousness of Harvey Logan before he heard the report. His head snapped to the side. His body slumped against the rock. The gun fell from his hand, clattering onto the stones. The blood from his head joined the blood from his shoulder, staining the Colorado earth a deep, rich red. The posse froze at the sound of the shot. They waited. There was no movement, no groans, no return fire. They advanced slowly, rifles shouldered. They came around the boulder. They saw the man lying there. They saw the wound in the shoulder. They saw the powder burns on the temple. They saw the devastating exit wound on the other side of his head. They stood over him in silence. They did not cheer. There was a solemnity to the scene. They recognized the physicality of the man, the scars, the muscle, the sheer toughness required to survive such a life. They saw a man who had chosen death over submission. Sheriff Stevens knelt down. He checked for a pulse, though it was unnecessary. "He's gone," the sheriff said. "Suicide." They strapped the body onto a pack horse. The journey down the mountain was a long, slow procession. The body bounced with the rhythm of the horse, stiffening as the rigor mortis set in. They brought him into the town of Glenwood Springs. They placed him on a cooling board at the undertaker's. The town buzzed with rumors. Who was he? Was it Tap Duncan? Was it a drifter? The Pinkerton National Detective Agency was summoned. They arrived with their files, their measurements, their photographs. They examined the corpse with the clinical detachment of scientists. They noted the scar on the wrist from the handcuffs in Knoxville. They noted the bullet wounds from previous fights. They compared the face to the wanted posters. The confirmation came. It was Harvey Logan. It was the kid. The man who had eluded them for so long was finally on the table. But the Pinkertons had not caught him. The sheriffs had not killed him. He had slipped through their fingers one last time, escaping into the void on his own terms. He was buried in the Linwood Cemetery on a hill overlooking the town. It was a pauper's grave, unmarked and simple. The earth was shoveled over the box, sealing away the violence and the rage. The wind blew through the grass, erasing the footprints of the mourners. The suicide at Parachute Creek was the end of the narrative. The Wild Bunch was history. The West was becoming a place of fences and laws, of automobiles and paved roads. Harvey Logan was an anachronism, a ghost from a time of blood and iron. He had gunned down lawmen ruthlessly, fighting a war against the encroaching future. But in that final standoff, trapped in the rocks, he realized that the only victory left was to choose his own defeat. He turned the table by refusing to play the final hand the law had dealt him. He folded his cards and left the game. The sun set over Glenwood Springs, casting long shadows across the valley. The train whistle blew in the distance, a lonely sound echoing off the canyon walls. It was the sound of the world moving on, leaving the grave on the hill behind in the darkness. Kid Curry was dead, but the silence he left behind was louder than any gunshot.